humiliated her in front of the entire marketplace. But what made a powerful prince suddenly ask for her hand in marriage? What happened between that moment of cruelty and this shocking proposal? This isn't just a story of royalty. It's a story of guilt, redemption, and unexpected love. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Ashford, a bustling market town nestled in the heart of medieval England. The air carried the mingled scents of freshly baked bread, livestock, and the earthy aroma of vegetables pulled from the surrounding farmlands. Merchants called out their wares while children darted between stalls, their laughter mixing with the general cacophony of commerce and conversation. The town square had transformed into a vibrant tapestry of colors and sounds, with farmers displaying their harvest, blacksmiths showcasing their metalwork, and weavers presenting fabrics dyed in rich hues of crimson, deep blue, and forest green. Among the crowd moved Ilara, a young woman of 22 summers whose beauty turned heads wherever she went, though she remained largely unaware of the effect she had on those around her. Her honey-blonde hair fell in waves down her back, partially concealed beneath a simple linen kerchief that marked her station as a peasant. Her eyes, the color of summer sky touched with hints of gray, held an intelligence and determination that set her apart from many in her position. She wore a dress of undyed wool, practical and modest, with long sleeves and a high neckline, over which she had wrapped a worn but clean apron. Her hands, though roughened by labor, moved with grace as she arranged the medicinal herbs she had gathered from the forest on a wooden table she had borrowed from old Thomas, the carpenter who had taken pity on her circumstances. Ilara had lived in Ashford her entire life, the daughter of a healer who had passed away 3 winters prior, leaving her alone in the world. Her mother had taught her everything about the properties of plants, how to identify them in the wild, and how to prepare remedies for common ailments. Since her mother's death, Ilara had struggled to maintain the small cottage on the outskirts of town, working tirelessly to gather and sell herbs, while also offering her healing services to those who could afford to pay, though she never turned away anyone in genuine need, regardless of their ability to compensate her. The morning had been productive. She had sold bundles of dried lavender to Lady Catherine's maid, chamomile to the baker's wife for her husband's troubled stomach, and willow bark to the miller who suffered from aching joints. The coins in her leather pouch, though few, represented hope for another week of survival, perhaps enough to purchase flour, a small amount of salted pork, and if fortune smiled upon her, a new pair of shoes to replace the ones that had worn through at the soles. The town square suddenly erupted in a different kind of commotion. The sound of hoofbeats on cobblestones echoed off the stone buildings surrounding the market, and people began scrambling to clear a path. Ilara looked up from her herbs to see a procession approaching, led by 6 mounted guards in polished chainmail that gleamed in the sunlight. They wore surcoats of deep burgundy emblazoned with the golden lion of the royal house, and their presence commanded immediate respect and fear in equal measure. Behind them rode a young man whose bearing and attire marked him as nobility of the highest order. Prince Edmund of Thornwood, heir to the throne of the realm, sat astride a magnificent destrier, a war horse of exceptional breeding with a coat as black as a moonless night. The prince himself appeared to be in his 25th year, with features that seemed carved by a master sculptor. His hair, dark as raven's wings, fell to his shoulders in waves that caught the light. His face was strong and defined, with a square jaw covered by carefully trimmed stubble, high cheekbones, and a straight nose that spoke of aristocratic lineage. His eyes, a striking shade of green that resembled emeralds, surveyed the crowd with an expression that combined boredom and barely concealed disdain. He wore a tunic of the finest wool, dyed a rich crimson and embroidered with gold thread in intricate patterns that depicted lions and roses. Over this, he had draped a heavy cloak of black fur, fastened at his broad shoulders with a clasp of gold and rubies. Leather breeches, supple and well-fitted, disappeared into riding boots of the highest quality, polished until they reflected the sky above. A sword hung at his hip, its pommel decorated with precious stones, and on his hands he wore gloves of soft leather that had never known a day of real labor. The prince's physical presence was undeniable. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad from years of training in the martial arts befitting his station. His arms, visible through the fitted sleeves of his tunic, showed the muscled definition of a warrior who practiced regularly with sword and lance. His chest was broad and powerful, his waist trim, and he carried himself with the unconscious arrogance of one who had never been denied anything in his life, who had never known hunger, cold, or the fear of an uncertain tomorrow. Elara, caught up in arranging her wares, had not moved quickly enough to clear the path. Her table sat partially in the street, and as the procession approached, one of the guards shouted at her, "Move aside, peasant! Clear the way for His Royal Highness!" Startled, Elara grabbed her table to pull it back, but in her haste, her foot caught on the uneven cobblestones. She stumbled forward, and the table tipped, sending her carefully arranged herbs scattering across the ground directly in the path of the approaching horses. Bundles of rosemary, thyme, and sage rolled under the hooves of the guards' mounts. Her precious stores of feverfew and comfrey, gathered during the early morning hours when the dew still clung to their leaves, were trampled into the dirt and mud of the street. The procession came to an abrupt halt. The lead guard's horse reared slightly, snorting in displeasure at the sudden obstacle. Prince Edmund's expression, already cool and distant, transformed into something darker. He dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the cobblestones with authority. The crowd, which had been buzzing with activity moments before, fell into an uneasy silence. People pressed back against the walls of buildings, unwilling to draw the royal attention to themselves. The prince strode forward, his cape billowing behind him in a way that would have been dramatic if the situation had not been so tense. He stopped before Elara, who had fallen to her knees in the street, desperately trying to gather what remained of her herbs, her hands trembling as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she could feel the heat of shame and fear rising to her cheeks. "What?" Prince Edmund began, his voice carrying across the now silent square with the sharp clarity of steel being drawn from a scabbard. "Is the meaning of this disturbance? Do you not know to clear the path when royalty approaches? Or are you so simple-minded that you cannot comprehend basic commands?" Elara's head snapped up at the harsh tone, and for a moment her eyes met his. She saw in those green depths no warmth, no compassion, only cold irritation at an inconvenience, as if she were nothing more than an insect that had dared to cross his path. Something in her spirit, the same stubbornness that had allowed her to survive alone for 3 years, refused to be completely cowed. "I apologize, Your Highness," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, though she kept her eyes lowered as was proper. "I was moving my table when I stumbled. It was not intentional. These herbs are my livelihood, and I—" "Your livelihood?" Edmund interrupted, his tone dripping with scorn. He looked down at the scattered plants with obvious distaste. "These weeds! You dare to block the passage of the Crown Prince for weeds?" He kicked at a bundle of lavender, sending it skittering across the cobblestones. "Perhaps you think yourself important, selling your pitiful wares in this market? Perhaps you believe that your needs supersede mine?" Elara felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry before this arrogant man, royal or not. "No, Your Highness, I know my place. I was simply trying to earn enough to eat, to survive. I meant no disrespect." "No disrespect?" Edmund's laugh was harsh and without humor. "You throw your refuse into the street before my horse, you cause my guard to halt, you waste my time with your clumsiness, and you claim no disrespect?" He turned to address the crowd that had gathered, his voice rising. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. When royalty passes, you move with haste and efficiency. You do not dawdle. You do not make excuses. This woman's incompetence has delayed my journey, and such behavior cannot be tolerated." He turned back to Elara, who remained on her knees, her hands still clutching a few crushed herbs. "What is your name, peasant?" "Elara, Your Highness. Elara of Ashford." "Well, Elara of Ashford, your clumsiness has cost you. Guards, ensure that this woman's table and all her belongings are removed from the market. She is forbidden from selling here for the next month. Perhaps that will teach her to be more mindful of her betters." The pronouncement fell like a thunderclap. Elara's face went white. A month without being able to sell in the market square would mean starvation. She had no other means of income, no other place to sell her goods. The surrounding villages were too far to reach on foot with any regularity, and the other markets in the region operated on different days, requiring travel she could not afford. "Please, Your Highness," she found herself saying, her pride finally breaking under the weight of desperation. Please, I beg you to reconsider. Without the market I cannot survive. I have no family, no other means. I will starve. I am truly sorry for the inconvenience. But please, show mercy." Edmund looked down at her, and for a fleeting instant, something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been uncertainty or the faintest stirring of conscience. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by steely resolve. "You should have thought of that before you blocked my path. Perhaps this will teach you and others like you to have proper respect for authority. Guards, see to it." 2 guards dismounted and moved toward Alara's table. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence as they began to dismantle her modest setup, throwing her remaining herbs into a pile in the gutter. Alara slowly rose to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her. She watched her livelihood being destroyed, watched a month of hard work gathering and preparing medicines being treated as worthless trash. Prince Edmund had already turned away, preparing to remount his horse. But something made him pause. Perhaps it was the way Alara stood there, straight-backed despite her tears, refusing to collapse even as her world crumbled around her. Perhaps it was the uncomfortable silence of the crowd, their disapproval palpable even though none dared voice it. Or perhaps it was the small voice in the back of his mind, the one he had learned to ignore over years of privilege, that whispered this was wrong, that this was cruel beyond what justice required. He shook off the feeling. He was the crown prince. He did not second-guess his decisions, especially not in front of commoners. He mounted his destrier in one smooth motion, gathering the reins in his gloved hands. "Move out," he commanded, and the procession began to move forward once more. As the horses passed, Alara stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the retreating figure of the prince. She felt something harden inside her chest, something cold and sharp like a shard of ice. She had always known that nobility cared little for the suffering of common people, but she had never experienced such casual cruelty, such complete disregard for another human being's survival, and all because of an accident, a stumble, a moment of misfortune. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some casting sympathetic glances in her direction, others hurrying away, unwilling to be associated with someone who had drawn royal displeasure. An older woman, Margaret the Weaver, approached and placed a gentle hand on Alara's shoulder. "Come, child, let me help you gather what can be saved." Together they knelt in the street, salvaging what few herbs had escaped being trampled or thrown into the filth of the gutter. It was precious little, hardly enough to sell even if she had been allowed to remain in the market. As Alara carefully wrapped the surviving plants in cloth, her mind raced. How would she pay for food? How would she keep her cottage? The landlord, a minor nobleman who owned several properties in Ashford, was not known for his patience with late payments. "What will you do?" Margaret asked quietly, echoing Alara's own thoughts. "I do not know," Alara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I truly do not know." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the market slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the incident already fading into the background noise of daily life. But for Alara, nothing would be the same. She had looked into the eyes of privilege and seen her own worthlessness reflected there. She had been judged, condemned, and punished, all for the crime of being poor and unfortunate enough to stumble at the wrong moment. And somewhere on the road leading away from Ashford, Prince Edmund rode in silence, his jaw set, trying and failing to forget the image of the peasant woman with sky-colored eyes standing amid the ruins of her livelihood, her spine straight and her gaze unwavering despite her tears. He told himself it did not matter. She was no one. The incident was already behind him, but the image lingered, stubbornly refusing to fade as the miles passed beneath his horse's hooves. The royal castle of Thornwood rose against the gray English sky like a monument to power and permanence. Its thick stone walls, built generations ago to withstand siege and storm, enclosed a world entirely separate from the one Alara inhabited in Ashford. Within those walls, Prince Edmund dismounted in the courtyard, his boots striking the flagstones with the same authority that had marked his every movement in the market square. Stable hands rushed forward to take his horse, bowing so low their foreheads nearly touched their knees. Edmund strode through the arched entrance of the keep, his cape swirling behind him. The interior was a stark contrast to the sunny warmth of the market town. Here, thick tapestries depicting hunting scenes and legendary battles hung from stone walls, their rich colors fighting against the perpetual dimness. Torches burned in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows that made the corridors seem alive with movement. The air smelled of beeswax candles, roasted meat from the kitchens below, and the musty scent of ancient stone that had stood for centuries. He made his way through familiar passages toward the great hall, where he knew his father would be holding court. King Harold of Thornwood was a man in his 53rd year, his once dark hair now streaked with silver, his face lined with the weight of 3 decades of rule. The king sat upon his throne, an imposing chair of carved oak adorned with gilded lions, listening to a dispute between 2 landowners over water rights. His expression was patient but weary, the look of a man who had heard every variation of human conflict and found them all equally tedious. Edmund waited at the edge of the hall until his father noticed his presence. King Harold's eyes, the same striking green as his son's, flickered toward Edmund, and he raised a hand to pause the proceedings. "We shall resume this matter on the morrow," he declared, his voice carrying the practiced authority of long rule. "My chamberlain will record your claims, and I shall render judgment after proper consideration." The landowners bowed and retreated, casting curious glances at the prince as they departed. When the hall had emptied of all but the most essential servants and guards, King Harold descended from his throne, his movements showing the stiffness of a warrior past his prime. "Edmund, I trust your inspection of the northern holdings proved fruitful. The lands are prosperous, father. The harvest will be abundant this year, and the people appear content with their lot." Edmund's tone was formal, the careful neutrality he always adopted when speaking with his father. Their relationship had always been more political than paternal, a dance of expectations and duties rather than affection. "Good. The stability of the realm depends upon the prosperity of our lands." Harold studied his son with an expression that Edmund could not quite decipher. "Walk with me. There is a matter we must discuss." They moved through the castle toward the king's private solar, a chamber warmed by a substantial fireplace and lined with shelves containing scrolls and bound volumes, precious things that represented the accumulated knowledge and history of their house. A large window overlooked the castle gardens, where late-blooming roses struggled against the approaching autumn. Harold poured wine from a silver flagon into 2 goblets, handing one to his son before settling into a high-backed chair near the fire. "You are 25 years old, Edmund. It is past time for you to take a wife." Edmund had known this conversation was inevitable, but its arrival still sent a ripple of discomfort through him. "I am aware of my duty, father. I have simply not yet found a suitable candidate among the noble houses." "Not found or not looked?" Harold's tone was mild, but there was steel beneath it. "I have been patient, allowing you to focus on your education and training, but patience has its limits. Lady Catherine of Westmore has expressed interest in an alliance. She is of good family, well-bred, and reportedly quite comely. The Westmore lands would strengthen our position in the Western Territories. Lady Catherine is 13 years old, father." Edmund's voice carried a note of distaste. "Barely more than a child." "She will grow," Harold replied pragmatically. "Such is the nature of these arrangements. You need not consummate the marriage immediately. A betrothal would suffice until she reaches a more appropriate age." Edmund moved to the window, staring out at the gardens without truly seeing them. The conversation was following the same tired pattern as every discussion about his future. Duty, alliance, strategic advantage. Never love, never happiness, never the possibility that he might choose his own path. What of Lady Beatrice of Ravencrest? She is of age, and her family's influence in the south would be valuable. Beatrice is already promised to Lord Thomas of Blackmere. The agreement was finalized last month. Harold sipped his wine, watching his son's reflection in the polished silver of his goblet. "You have put this off long enough, Edmund. As Crown Prince, your marriage is not merely a personal matter. It affects the stability of the realm, the strength of our alliances, the future of our dynasty. I understand my responsibilities, father." Edmund's jaw tightened with frustration he dared not fully express. "But surely I deserve some say in choosing the woman who will share my life, who will bear my children, who will one day be queen. You have as much say as your position allows, which is to say, you may express preferences, but the final decision must serve the realm." Harold's tone softened slightly. "I know this seems harsh, my son, but I too was in your position once. I too chafed against the constraints of duty. Yet I did what was necessary, as must you." Edmund knew his father's history. King Harold had been married to Edmund's mother, Queen Anne, in a political alliance that had brought peace to warring territories. By all accounts, they had developed a fondness for each other over the years, though whether it could truly be called love was a question Edmund had never dared to ask. His mother had died giving birth to his younger sister, Victoria, when Edmund was only 7 years old. That loss had hardened something in his father, made him even more focused on duty and stability at the expense of all softer emotions. "I will give the matter serious consideration," Edmund said finally, knowing it was the most defiance he could offer without creating a true conflict. "See that you do. I will arrange meetings with several suitable candidates over the coming months. You will treat them with courtesy and give each fair consideration." Harold stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "Now tell me more of your journey. Were there any matters requiring my attention?" Edmund hesitated. The incident in Ashford flickered through his mind, the image of the peasant woman kneeling in the street amid her scattered herbs. For reasons he could not fully articulate, he found himself reluctant to mention it. "Nothing of significance, father. The usual petty disputes and minor grievances, all handled appropriately." That night Edmund dined in the great hall alongside the court. The long tables were laden with roasted venison, fresh bread, wheels of cheese, and fruits preserved in honey. Musicians played softly in the gallery above, their melodies barely audible over the conversation and laughter of nobles dressed in their finest woolens and silks. Edmund sat at the high table, picking at his food while nodding politely at the observations of Lord Chancellor Reginald, a portly man whose main talent seemed to be talking at great length while saying very little of substance. To his left sat his younger sister, Princess Victoria, now 18 and beautiful in the way that came from good breeding and a life free from hardship. Her hair, the same raven darkness as Edmund's, was elaborately braided and decorated with pearls. Her gown was deep blue velvet with sleeves that trailed nearly to the floor, and around her neck she wore a pendant of sapphires set in gold. Despite their shared blood, Edmund and Victoria had never been particularly close. She had been raised primarily by nurses and tutors while he had been groomed for kingship, and the 7 years between them had always seemed an unbridgeable gulf. "You seem troubled, brother," Victoria observed, her voice carrying the carefully modulated tones of courtly education. "Did something occur during your travels?" "Nothing worth discussing," Edmund replied, reaching for his wine goblet. The vintage was excellent, rich and smooth, but it did nothing to ease the strange restlessness that had settled over him since returning to the castle. "Father says he intends to see you married soon." Victoria's eyes sparkled with something that might have been mischief or might have been genuine curiosity. "There are wagers among the ladies at court regarding who will capture the crown prince's hand. Lady Sophia believes it will be someone from the northern houses. Lady Jane insists you will choose based on beauty rather than political advantage." "Lady Jane does not know me very well then." Edmund's tone was sharper than he intended, and he saw Victoria draw back slightly, her expression closing off. He softened his voice. "Forgive me, sister. I am poor company tonight. The journey was long, and I find myself fatigued." "Of course." Victoria turned her attention back to her meal. The brief moment of potential connection already passed. Edmund excused himself before the final course was served, claiming exhaustion, though in truth he felt restless rather than tired. He made his way to his chambers, a suite of rooms in the eastern tower that had been his since childhood. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting noble hunts and heroic deeds. A large bed dominated one wall, its posts carved with intertwining vines and lions. A desk sat near the window, covered with maps and correspondence he had been neglecting. His manservant, Geoffrey, appeared silently to help him remove the formal attire required for dinner. Geoffrey was a man of middle years who had served Edmund since the prince was a boy, and he performed his duties with the quiet efficiency of long practice. "Will you require anything else, Your Highness?" "No, Geoffrey. You may retire for the evening." Alone finally, Edmund moved to the window and stared out at the darkening landscape. Beyond the castle walls, beyond the immediate grounds, lay the realm he would one day rule. Thousands of people whose names he would never know, whose lives he would never understand, whose problems seemed so distant from his own privileged existence. Except one whose name he did know, Ilara of Ashford. He could still see her face, the way her sky-colored eyes had met his with a mixture of fear and defiance. He could still hear her voice, steady despite her terror, explaining that the herbs were her livelihood, begging for mercy he had refused to grant. The memory brought with it an uncomfortable sensation, something Edmund was not accustomed to feeling: guilt. It crept through him like cold water, making him shift uncomfortably. He tried to push it away, to rationalize his actions. She had been clumsy. She had blocked his path. Some punishment had been warranted to maintain proper respect for authority. These were all true statements, yet they did nothing to ease the growing conviction that he had been unnecessarily cruel. A month's banishment from the market for an accident. A month during which she would have no income, no means to feed herself. He had pronounced that sentence as casually as he might have ordered another goblet of wine, never truly considering what it would mean for her survival. The realization settled in his stomach like a stone. Edmund turned from the window and began to pace the length of his chamber. This was foolishness. She was a peasant, no one of importance. He had made thousands of decisions affecting the lives of common people, implementing laws and policies that shaped their existence in ways far more significant than denying one woman access to a market. Why should this particular incident trouble him? But it did trouble him. It troubled him in a way he could not dismiss or rationalize away. Perhaps it was because he had seen her face, looked into her eyes, witnessed the direct impact of his words. Perhaps it was because some part of him, the part he had learned to suppress in favor of princely dignity and royal bearing, recognized that he had used his power not to maintain order or uphold justice, but simply because he could, because he was irritated and she was convenient. He thought of his father's words about duty and responsibility. King Harold spoke often of the burden of leadership, of making difficult decisions for the good of the realm. But what good had been served by humiliating Alara? What principle had been upheld beyond his own wounded pride at being momentarily inconvenienced? Edmund threw himself into the chair at his desk, resting his head in his hands. The complications of his own life suddenly seemed trivial compared to the simple, stark reality of survival that Alara faced. He worried about political marriages and courtly obligations, while she worried about having enough to eat. The contrast was jarring, forcing him to confront the vast chasm that separated his world from hers. Sleep, when it finally came, was troubled. Edmund dreamed of market squares and scattered herbs, of sky-colored eyes filled with accusation, of a voice asking him why he thought his convenience was worth more than another person's life. He woke before dawn, tangled in sweat-dampened sheets, the dreams fading but their emotional residue remaining like a bitter taste. In Ashford, Alara also woke before dawn, but not from troubled dreams. She woke because she had work to do, because survival demanded action regardless of how impossible the situation seemed. Her small cottage, which had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that, sat at the edge of the forest. It was a simple structure of timber and thatch, with a single main room dominated by a large fireplace, a smaller sleeping chamber, and a shed for storing herbs and preparing medicines. She had spent the previous evening taking inventory of what remained after the incident in the market square. It was painfully little: some dried lavender, a small quantity of sage, a few roots of valerian. Not enough to sell, barely enough to use for her own needs. The coins in her purse would buy perhaps a week's worth of food if she was careful, after which she would have nothing. Alara wrapped herself in her threadbare cloak and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The forest loomed before her, mysterious and slightly threatening in the absence of sunlight, but she had walked these paths since childhood and knew them better than the lines of her own palm. She carried a basket and a small knife, tools of her trade that had belonged to her mother. The forest floor was damp with dew, and the air carried the crisp bite of approaching autumn. Alara moved through the trees with practiced ease, identifying plants by touch and scent in the dim light. She gathered what she could find: mushrooms growing on rotting logs, roots that could be dried and ground into powder for treating fever, leaves with properties useful for treating wounds. It was slow work, and the harvest was meager, but it was all she had. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Alara found herself at a small clearing where a stream ran cold and clear over smooth stones. This had been one of her mother's favorite spots, a place of peace and natural beauty. She sat on a fallen log and allowed herself a moment of stillness, watching the water flow past, constant and unchanging regardless of human troubles. The stream burbled softly over the stones, its voice a gentle counterpoint to Alara's troubled thoughts. She dipped her hands into the cold water, letting it numb her fingers as she watched the current swirl around them. Her mother had taught her that water always found its way forward, always moved around obstacles, always persisted until it reached its destination. The lesson seemed hollow now, when the obstacle before her appeared insurmountable. A month without the market. 4 weeks during which she could not sell, could not earn, could not survive by the means she had relied upon since her mother's death. Ilara's mind raced through possibilities, each one presenting its own impossible challenges. She could try to travel to other towns, but the distances were too great to walk carrying her wares, and she had no horse or cart. She could offer her services as a healer directly to households, but most families in Ashford already knew her, and those who wanted her help came to the market. Approaching the homes of strangers might be seen as presumptuous or desperate. She could seek employment in one of the larger households. The thought made her stomach tighten with anxiety. Service meant giving up her independence, her cottage, her mother's legacy. It meant long hours of backbreaking labor for minimal compensation, subject to the whims and moods of masters who might be kind or cruel. And even if she sought such work, there was no guarantee anyone would hire her. Workers were plentiful, and she had no special skills beyond her healing knowledge. The sun climbed higher, and Ilara knew she needed to return to her cottage. She had plants to process, remedies to prepare, even if she had no immediate means to sell them. Keeping her hands busy helped quiet the panic that threatened to overwhelm her when she allowed herself to fully contemplate her situation. As she walked back through the forest, basket heavy with her morning's gathering, she became aware of voices ahead on the path. She slowed her pace, instinctively cautious. 2 men stood in a small clearing, their clothing marking them as servants or workers from one of the larger estates. They were speaking in low tones, but as Ilara drew closer, fragments of their conversation reached her ears. "Heard the prince himself ordered it," one was saying. "Banned her from the market for a month, just for being in his way. Cruel business that," the other replied. "She's got no family, no other means. What's she supposed to do? Not our concern, is it? Royalty does as it pleases. Always has, always will." Ilara's cheeks burned with humiliation as she realized they were discussing her. The incident had already become gossip, spreading through the town and beyond. She was no longer simply Ilara the healer, but Ilara who had offended the crown prince, Ilara who had been publicly punished and humiliated. The shame of it cut deeper than the practical concerns about survival. She waited until the men had moved on before continuing down the path, her head down and her steps quick. When she finally reached her cottage, she bolted the door behind her and leaned against it, breathing hard as if she had run a great distance. The walls of her small home, which had always felt like safety and sanctuary, now seemed to press in on her like a cage. At Thornwood Castle, Prince Edmund was enduring what he privately considered torture disguised as breakfast. Lady Sophia of Blackwater had arrived the previous evening, one of the potential brides his father had insisted he meet. She sat across from him now in the smaller dining hall reserved for more intimate gatherings, picking delicately at honeyed figs while maintaining a stream of cheerful conversation that required minimal participation from Edmund. Lady Sophia was pretty in a conventional way, with golden hair arranged in elaborate braids and a round, pleasant face. Her dress was pale pink silk with silver embroidery, cut to emphasize her figure without being improper. She was 17, well-educated, and her family's lands in the Eastern Territories made her a politically advantageous match. On parchment, she was everything a crown prince could want in a wife. In reality, Edmund found her utterly exhausting, and then Mother said that we simply must have new tapestries for the Great Hall, because the old ones are positively ancient, at least 40 years old, can you imagine? Sophia laughed, a sound like tinkling bells that Edmund suspected she had practiced. Of course, Father protested about the expense, but Mother can be quite persuasive when she sets her mind to something. Do you find that women are naturally more attuned to matters of decoration and beauty, Your Highness? I confess I have not given the matter much thought, Lady Sophia. Edmund forced a polite smile, acutely aware of his father watching from the head of the table with an expression of pointed expectation. Oh, but you must have opinions on such things. A well-appointed castle reflects the refinement of its lord, after all. Sophia leaned forward conspiratorially, lowering her voice. I have heard that Thornwood Castle is magnificent, but I wonder if a woman's touch might enhance certain aspects. The gardens, for instance, could benefit from a more romantic design, with arbors and flowering vines. Don't you agree? Edmund glanced toward the window, beyond which the castle gardens stretched in their current practical arrangement of herb beds and vegetable plots interspersed with some ornamental plantings. His mother had designed them that way, favoring utility over pure aesthetics. The thought of someone coming in and changing them, erasing that last tangible connection to Queen Anne, sent a spike of irritation through him. The gardens serve their purpose adequately, he said, his tone cooler than he intended. Sophia's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly, launching into a new topic about the upcoming harvest festival. Edmund listened with half an ear, making appropriate noises at what seemed like appropriate intervals, while his mind wandered to matters he found infinitely more compelling than decorative tapestries. He had made discreet inquiries about Ashford through one of his servants, asking general questions about the town and its people. The servant, a young man named Peter, who had family in the area, had been forthcoming with information. Ashford was prosperous by peasant standards, its market well attended and its lands productive. Among its residents was a healer woman, daughter of another healer, who had gained something of a reputation for her skill with herbs and remedies. "She's quite sought after, Your Highness," Peter had said. "My aunt swears the woman cured her son's fever when he was near death. Kind soul by all accounts, though she's fallen on hard times since her mother passed. Lives alone now, scrapes by on what she can earn from her healing work." Edmund had thanked Peter and dismissed him, but the information had only deepened his discomfort. A kind soul, sought after for her healing skills, living alone and struggling to survive. And he had casually destroyed her ability to earn a living for an entire month, because she had stumbled in his path. "Your Highness?" "Edmund." His father's voice cut through his thoughts. Edmund realized the table had fallen silent and everyone was looking at him expectantly. "Forgive me, I was distracted by a matter of state," Edmund said smoothly, though he had no idea what question he had failed to answer. King Harold's expression suggested he was not fooled by the excuse. "Lady Sophia was asking if you might show her the castle grounds before she departs tomorrow. I believe a walk would be beneficial for you both." It was not truly a question, and Edmund knew better than to refuse. "Of course, it would be my pleasure, Lady Sophia." Sophia's face lit up with genuine delight. "Oh, how wonderful. I have so wanted to see the famous rose garden. They say Queen Anne designed it herself, and that the blooms are spectacular even this late in the season." The walk, undertaken an hour later after Sophia had changed into what she deemed more appropriate outdoor attire, was exactly as tedious as Edmund had anticipated. Sophia maintained a constant flow of conversation, pointing out features she found charming and suggesting improvements with the confidence of someone who had never been told that her opinions might not be universally welcomed. "These roses would look lovely with some white lilies interspersed," she mused, gesturing at a bed of deep red blooms, "and perhaps some lavender along the borders for fragrance and color contrast. The roses were my mother's favorite," Edmund said quietly. "She chose each variety specifically for this garden. I would prefer they remain as she intended." Sophia had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Of course, Your Highness. Forgive me. I meant no disrespect to Queen Anne's memory. I simply enjoy imagining how spaces might evolve and change." They walked in silence for a few moments, following a gravel path that wound between carefully tended beds. Despite his general disinterest in the outing, Edmund found himself genuinely looking at the garden for the first time in months. His mother had indeed loved these roses, spending hours among them even when her health had begun to fail during her pregnancy with Victoria. He remembered her kneeling in the dirt, her fine gowns forgotten, her hands dark with soil as she carefully tended each plant. She had known the properties of many plants, he recalled suddenly, not to the extent of a trained healer, but she had kept her own small collection of herbs and had made simple remedies for minor ailments. It was considered a proper occupation for a queen, overseeing the health and comfort of the household. Edmund remembered her mixing preparations in the still room, the air thick with the scent of crushed lavender and chamomile. The memory brought with it an unexpected connection to Ilara, kneeling in the street surrounded by her scattered herbs. The image superimposed itself over his memory of his mother in the garden, and Edmund felt something twist in his chest. Both women working with plants, using them to heal and help others. But his mother had done so from a position of absolute security, while Ilara did so out of desperate necessity, and he had taken even that small security away from her. "Your Highness?" Are you unwell? You seem quite pale. Sophia's voice was tinged with concern, and Edmund realized he had stopped walking and was gripping the edge of a stone fountain with white knuckles. I am fine, Lady Sophia, merely troubled by a matter that requires my attention. He straightened, releasing the fountain and forcing his expression back into neutral pleasantness. Forgive me, but I must cut our walk short. There is an issue I have been neglecting that demands immediate action. Sophia looked disappointed, but masked it quickly with a polite smile. Of course, Your Highness. Matters of state must take precedence. Thank you for the time you have already spared me. Edmund bowed formally and retreated toward the castle, his pace just short of an undignified run. He needed to think, needed to decide what, if anything, he was going to do about the situation in Ashford. The reasonable part of his mind insisted that he had already made his decision, that the punishment had been pronounced and could not be withdrawn without appearing weak and indecisive. A prince did not reverse his judgments on a whim, but another part of his mind, a part that had been growing louder over the past 2 days, insisted that this was not about appearing weak. This was about recognizing when he had been unjust and finding the courage to correct his mistake. The question was how to do so without humiliating himself or undermining his authority. Back in her cottage, Alara had spread her morning's gathering across her work table and was sorting through it with practiced efficiency. Mushrooms in one pile, roots in another, leaves in a third. Each would require different preparation. The mushrooms would need to be dried quickly before they spoiled. The roots would be cleaned, cut, and dried slowly. The leaves would be bundled and hung from the rafters. It was methodical work that usually brought her peace, but today her mind refused to settle. She kept calculating and recalculating the contents of her coin purse against the cost of basic necessities. No matter how she arranged the numbers, they did not add up to survival for an entire month. A knock at her door startled her from her anxious thoughts. Visitors were rare, and for a moment Alara felt a spike of fear. Had the prince's guards come to ensure she was complying with his orders? Had some new punishment been devised? She opened the door to find Margaret the weaver standing on her threshold, a cloth-wrapped bundle in her arms and a determined expression on her weathered face. "May I come in, child?" Alara stepped aside, and Margaret entered, looking around the small cottage with the frank assessment of someone who had lived a long life and learned to see clearly. She set the bundle on the table, unwrapping it to reveal a loaf of fresh bread, a small wheel of cheese, and several apples. "I cannot accept this," Alara said immediately, though her stomach growled at the sight of the food. "You have your own needs, Margaret. I cannot take from you." "Nonsense. You can, and you will." Margaret's tone brooked no argument. "I am old, and my children are grown. They ensure I never want for anything. You, on the other hand, are young and alone, and have been dealt an unfair blow by someone who should know better." Tears pricked at Alara's eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. "I do not know how to thank you. Thank me by surviving this month, and by remembering that not everyone with power chooses to abuse it." Margaret settled into one of the 2 chairs at Alara's small table, her expression turning serious. "I have lived through 4 reigns, girl. I have seen good kings and poor ones, just princes and tyrants. Prince Edmund is young yet. Time will tell what manner of ruler he becomes. Time will not change what he did to me." Alara's voice was harder than she intended. "Time will not fill my stomach or pay my landlord. No, it will not. But time and circumstance have a way of teaching lessons to those willing to learn them." Margaret paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "My son works in the stables at Thornwood Castle. He tells me the prince has been asking questions about Ashford, about its people and its trade." Alara frowned. Why would the crown prince concern himself with a small market town? That, child, is an interesting question, is it not? Margaret stood, preparing to leave. Perhaps he is simply ensuring his orders are being followed, or perhaps his conscience, if he possesses one, is troubling him. Either way, you would do well to continue gathering your herbs and preparing your remedies. A month passes more quickly than you might think, and when it is over you will want to be ready to resume your work. After Margaret left, Alara sat at her table and allowed herself to eat a portion of the bread and cheese. The food was simple but nourishing, and it eased the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. As she ate, she thought about what Margaret had said. Could the prince truly be feeling remorse for his actions? The idea seemed almost laughable. Men of his station did not concern themselves with the fates of peasant women they had punished. And yet, Margaret's son had no reason to lie about the prince asking questions. What could it mean? Ilara tried to imagine Prince Edmund regretting his cruelty, tried to picture him losing sleep over her plight the way she had lost sleep worrying about her survival. The image would not form. In her mind he remained as he had appeared in the market square, cold, arrogant, utterly indifferent to suffering he had caused. 3 days had passed since the incident in the market square, and Prince Edmund found himself in an increasingly foul mood that no amount of hunting, swordplay, or wine seemed to alleviate. He sat now in the castle's council chamber, ostensibly listening to Lord Chancellor Reginald drone on about tax revenues from the northern territories, but his mind was elsewhere entirely. The chamber was a long room dominated by a massive oak table around which sat the king's most trusted advisors. Tapestries depicting the lineage of the Thornwood dynasty covered the walls, and tall windows let in the pale autumn sunlight. Edmund's father occupied the chair at the head of the table, his expression one of patient attention that Edmund knew from experience could shift to sharp focus the moment something truly important arose. The harvest projections suggest we will exceed last year's yields by approximately 15%, Reginald was saying, consulting a scroll covered in neat columns of figures. This should provide ample reserves for the winter months and allow us to increase exports to the southern kingdoms, thereby strengthening our trade relationships. And what provisions exist for those who cannot afford to purchase grain, even in times of plenty? Edmund heard himself ask, interrupting the chancellor mid-sentence. The table fell silent. Every face turned toward him with varying expressions of surprise. It was not like the crown prince to involve himself in administrative discussions, much less to ask questions about the welfare of the poor. King Harold's eyes narrowed slightly. There are customary arrangements, he said carefully. The church distributes alms. Noble houses provide for their tenants in times of genuine hardship. Local magistrates have discretionary funds for emergency relief. Why do you ask? Edmund shifted in his seat, aware that he had drawn more attention to himself than he had intended. I merely wondered about the mechanisms in place, a theoretical interest in how the realm cares for its most vulnerable subjects. A commendable interest, Lord Reginald interjected, clearly eager to return to his presentation. Though I assure your highness, such systems have functioned adequately for generations. Now, if we might return to the matter of tax revenues. Adequately. Edmund tasted the word as if it were sour wine. Tell me, Lord Chancellor, if a person were suddenly deprived of their means of earning a living through no fault of their own, would these adequate systems ensure they did not starve? The silence this time was longer and distinctly uncomfortable. Lord Reginald glanced at the king, seeking guidance. Several of the other councillors exchanged puzzled looks. Edmund's father leaned back in his chair, studying his son with an expression that combined curiosity and concern. That would depend upon the specific circumstances, Reginald said slowly. If the person had family, they might provide support. If they were part of a guild, there might be assistance available. If they had served a noble house loyally, that house might extend charity. But a solitary individual with no connections or resources would face considerable difficulty. They might starve, in other words. It is possible, yes, though most people manage to find some means of survival, even in dire circumstances. Reginald's discomfort was palpable. Your Highness, forgive me, but has something specific prompted these questions? Edmund realized he was treading on dangerous ground. If he revealed his growing crisis of conscience about the incident in Ashford, it would spread through the court like wildfire. Every decision he made would be questioned and analyzed for signs of weakness or indecision. And yet, the evasion felt cowardly, a refusal to face the consequences of his own actions. I observed a situation during my recent travels, he said carefully. A situation that made me consider the impact of certain decisions on those with no power or resources to weather them. I found myself wondering about our responsibility as rulers to consider such impacts. King Harold's expression softened slightly. A thoughtful concern, my son, and one that does you credit. We who wield power must indeed be mindful of how that power affects those subject to it. However, we must also maintain order and authority. If every punishment were weighed against the potential hardship it might cause, we would soon have no authority at all. People would learn they could escape consequences by claiming poverty or difficulty. But surely there is a difference between just punishment and excessive cruelty, Edmund argued, leaning forward in his chair. between maintaining order and causing unnecessary suffering? Of course there is. That is why judgment must be exercised with wisdom and restraint. Harold's tone took on the quality it always had when he was imparting what he considered important lessons. A good ruler must find the balance between mercy and justice, between compassion and strength. Too much of either quality leads to poor governance. Edmund wanted to argue further, to point out that what he had done to Ilara had been neither wise nor balanced, but the assembled counselors were already beginning to murmur among themselves, and he knew that pressing the matter would only invite more scrutiny. He forced himself to settle back in his chair and let the council meeting continue without further interruption. When the session finally concluded and the counselors filed out, King Harold gestured for Edmund to remain. Father and son sat alone in the chamber, the silence stretching between them until Harold finally spoke. "This situation you observed. Tell me about it." Edmund had known this moment was coming, yet he still found himself reluctant to provide details. "A minor incident, Father. A peasant woman in Ashford accidentally obstructed my path in the market. I ordered her banned from selling there for a month as punishment. And now you regret the severity of that punishment." It was not a question, and Edmund saw no point in denying it. "She depends upon the market for her survival. I learned afterward that she is alone, without family or other means of support. A month's banishment may well mean starvation." Harold was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You pronounced judgment publicly, I assume?" "Yes." "Then you face a dilemma. If you reverse the decision, you appear weak and indecisive. If you allow it to stand, you must live with the knowledge that you may have condemned an innocent woman to death for a moment's clumsiness." Harold's eyes met his son's. "Welcome to the burdens of leadership, Edmund. These are the choices that will define your reign." "What would you do?" Edmund asked, genuinely uncertain. "That depends. If I believed the punishment was just, I would let it stand regardless of personal discomfort. If I believed it was unjust, I would find a way to correct it without appearing to simply change my mind." Harold stood, moving to the window. "There are ways to provide assistance without publicly reversing a judgment. Anonymous charity, indirect intervention. A creative ruler can find solutions that serve both justice and mercy. You are suggesting I help her secretly. I am suggesting that you consider all available options and choose the one that best serves both the woman's needs and your position." Harold turned back to face his son. "But I am also suggesting that you examine why this particular case troubles you so deeply. You have made hundreds of decisions that affected people's lives. What makes this woman different?" Edmund had been asking himself the same question for 3 days without finding a satisfactory answer. "I do not know, Father. Perhaps because I saw her face. Perhaps because the punishment was pronounced in anger rather than reasoned judgment. Perhaps because I have had time to reflect and recognize my own injustice. Or perhaps," Harold said quietly, "because you are growing into the man you need to be. A man who questions his own actions and seeks to correct his mistakes. That is not weakness, Edmund. That is wisdom." The conversation ended with Edmund feeling both validated in his concerns and uncertain about how to proceed. As he left the council chamber and made his way back through the castle's corridors, his mind churned with possibilities. Anonymous assistance seemed cowardly, a way to ease his conscience without truly facing what he had done. But publicly reversing his decision would invite exactly the kind of scrutiny and questioning of his authority that his father had warned against. He found himself in the castle's library, a room he rarely visited despite its impressive collection of manuscripts and bound volumes. The air smelled of old parchment and leather, and dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through high windows. Edmund ran his fingers along the spines of books, not really seeing them, until one title caught his eye, "On the Duties of Princes and the Art of Just Governance." He pulled the volume from the shelf and settled into one of the reading chairs scattered throughout the library. The book had been written 2 centuries earlier by a scholar who had advised 3 kings, and its pages were filled with observations about the nature of power and responsibility. Edmund found himself absorbed in a chapter discussing the relationship between rulers and subjects, the mutual obligations that bound them together in the fabric of society. "A prince who rules through fear alone will find that fear a brittle foundation," the author had written. "True authority comes not from the power to punish, but from the willingness to be just. The subject who obeys out of respect for law and fairness is far more valuable than the one who obeys only to avoid retribution." Edmund read the passage 3 times, feeling as though it spoke directly to his current predicament. He had wielded power in Ashford through fear and authority, demanding obedience without consideration for justice or fairness, and now that power felt hollow, a thing that brought no satisfaction and considerable shame. Meanwhile, in her small cottage on the edge of Ashford, Elara was facing a different kind of crisis. Her landlord, Sir Geoffrey of Thornbridge, had arrived that morning to collect the month's rent, and the conversation had gone poorly. Sir Geoffrey was a man in his 40th year, stout and red-faced, who had inherited several properties in the area from his father. He was not a cruel landlord by the standards of the time, but neither was he particularly generous or understanding. He sat now in Elara's cottage, his bulk making her small chair creak ominously, his expression one of calculated sympathy that did not reach his eyes. "I understand your situation, Mistress Elara. Truly I do," he was saying, his voice carrying the false warmth of someone who was about to deliver bad news. "The incident with the Crown Prince was most unfortunate. However, business is business, and I cannot simply forego rent because you have fallen on hard times." Elara stood before him, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from trembling. "I am not asking you to forego payment, Sir Geoffrey. I am simply requesting an extension until I can resume selling in the market. I have always paid promptly before. Surely my history as a reliable tenant counts for something." It does," Geoffrey agreed, nodding his head so vigorously his multiple chins wobbled. "Which is why I am willing to be reasonable. I will give you 2 weeks. If you cannot produce the rent by then, I will require you to vacate the property so that I might find a tenant who can pay. 2 weeks. Half the time of her banishment from the market. Elara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "Sir Geoffrey, please. This cottage was my mother's and my grandmother's before her. It is all I have left of my family. Surely we can reach some other arrangement." "What arrangement did you have in mind?" Geoffrey's tone suggested he already knew she had nothing to offer and he was simply going through the motions of negotiation. Elara's mind raced. "I could provide healing services to your household, free of charge for the next year. I could tend your gardens, prepare medicines for your family. My skills are valuable. I already have a physician on retainer, a learned man from the university," Geoffrey said dismissively. "What need have I for a herb woman's remedies? No, Mistress Elara, I require coin, not services. 2 weeks. That is the most generous extension I can offer." After he left, Elara sank into her chair and allowed herself the luxury of tears. They came hot and angry, tears of frustration and fear and helplessness. She had always been so careful, so responsible. She had worked hard, saved when she could, never asked for charity or lived beyond her means. And now, through no fault of her own, everything was collapsing. When the tears finally subsided, leaving her feeling hollow and exhausted, Elara forced herself to think practically. 2 weeks meant she needed to earn enough for rent before the month's banishment ended. That meant finding work outside the market, work that could be done quickly and paid reasonably well. The problem was that such work barely existed. Most households that needed servants had permanent staff. Seasonal work in the fields was largely finished for the year. The crafts guilds would not accept her without years of apprenticeship. Her options were desperately limited. She spent the afternoon visiting every shop and workshop in Ashford, offering her services for any kind of work. The responses ranged from apologetic refusals to outright hostility. Several merchants made it clear they wanted nothing to do with someone who had offended the Crown Prince. Others simply had no work to offer. By the time the sun began to set, Elara had exhausted every possibility she could think of, and had nothing to show for her efforts but sore feet and a deeper sense of despair. That evening, as she sat in her cottage preparing a meager dinner of bread and the vegetables from her small garden, Elara found herself thinking about Prince Edmund in a way she had not before. She had been angry at him, had seen him as nothing more than a privileged tyrant who had casually destroyed her life. But now she found herself wondering about him as a person. Did he ever think about the consequences of his actions? Did he sleep peacefully at night, unbothered by the suffering he caused? Or did he perhaps lie awake sometimes, troubled by the weight of his decisions? The thought that he might actually feel remorse seemed almost fantastical. Men like him did not concern themselves with people like her. They moved through the world, taking what they wanted, doing as they pleased, never looking back at the wreckage they left behind. And yet, Margaret had said he was asking questions about Ashford. What did that mean? Was it simple curiosity or something more? Ilara shook her head, frustrated with herself for wasting mental energy on such speculation. Whether Prince Edmund felt guilt or indifference made no practical difference to her situation. She needed to focus on survival, on finding a way to pay her rent and keep her home. Wondering about the emotional state of the man who had caused her problems was a luxury she could not afford. But as she lay in her bed that night, staring at the darkened ceiling of her sleeping chamber, the question persisted. What kind of man was Prince Edmund, really? And if he did feel remorse, would it be enough to make him act? Or would he simply push the guilt aside and continue with his privileged life, leaving her to face the consequences of his actions alone? The decision came to Edmund in the depths of night, pulling him from restless sleep with the clarity of certainty. He could not undo what he had done through intermediaries or anonymous gestures. He could not ease his conscience with gold passed through servants' hands or quiet instructions to the market master to look the other way. If he was to correct his mistake, he needed to face it directly, to confront the woman he had wronged and find a way to make amends that honored both justice and his position. The next morning, Edmund summoned Geoffrey, his manservant, before dawn had fully broken. The older man appeared quickly, still fastening his doublet, his expression concerned at being called at such an unusual hour. "Geoffrey, I require traveling clothes. Simple garments, nothing that marks me as royalty. And I will need a horse prepared, but not my destrier. Something less conspicuous." Geoffrey's eyebrows rose in surprise, but years of service had taught him when to ask questions and when to simply obey. "Of course, Your Highness. Might I inquire as to the destination?" "For safety considerations, you understand. Ashford. I travel alone, and I do not wish my father or anyone else to know of this journey. Can I trust your discretion?" "Always, Your Highness." Geoffrey paused, then added carefully, "Traveling alone is unwise. At least allow me to follow at a distance in case you encounter difficulties." Edmund considered this. His first instinct was to refuse, to insist on complete solitude, but Geoffrey's concern was not unfounded. The roads, while generally safe in this part of the realm, were not without dangers. Bandits, though rare, were not unheard of, and a lone traveler made an easy target. "Very well, but you maintain your distance and reveal yourself to no one unless I am in genuine danger. This matter is delicate." An hour later, Edmund rode out from Thornwood Castle dressed in simple wool and leather, his fine features partially concealed beneath a hooded cloak. The horse beneath him was a solid gelding, unremarkable in every way, the kind of mount a prosperous merchant might ride. He had left a note for his father claiming he needed time alone to think, which was true enough if incomplete. The journey to Ashford took most of the morning. Edmund used the time to rehearse what he might say, how he might approach Ilara without either humiliating himself or appearing to simply buy her forgiveness. Every imagined conversation seemed inadequate, every prepared speech hollow and insufficient. The truth was that he had no idea how to navigate this situation. His entire life had been spent in environments where his word was law, where apologies were rarely necessary, and admissions of error were seen as weakness. Now he was voluntarily placing himself in a position of vulnerability, seeking to make amends to someone who had every reason to despise him. Ashford appeared through the trees as the sun reached its zenith. The market square was busy with its usual midday activity, though Edmund noticed it seemed less crowded than it had been during his official visit. He dismounted at the edge of the town and led his horse to a public stable, paying the boy who took the reins with a coin that made the youth's eyes widen. Edmund pulled his hood lower over his face and began to walk through the town, listening to conversations and trying to orient himself. He needed to find Ilara's cottage, but he could hardly ask directly without drawing unwanted attention. Instead, he wandered seemingly aimlessly, keeping his ears open for useful information. It was easier than he had expected. Within minutes, he overheard two women discussing poor Ilara the healer and how shameful it was that she had been banned from the market. They spoke about her cottage on the forest road, how she must be struggling terribly, how someone should organize help for her. Following their directions, Edmund made his way to the outskirts of town. The forest road was little more than a dirt path rutted by cartwheels and softened by fallen leaves. He walked for perhaps 20 minutes before he saw the cottage, a small timber structure with a thatched roof that had seen better days. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was home. Edmund's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached. This was madness. He was the crown prince of the realm, and he was about to knock on a peasant woman's door to apologize for his behavior. If anyone discovered this, the scandal would be immense. His father would be furious. The court would question his judgment and fitness to rule. But even as these thoughts raced through his mind, Edmund found his hand rising to knock on the weathered wooden door. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of the forest. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Edmund wondered if perhaps Ilara was not home, if he had made this journey for nothing. Then the door opened, and there she was. Ilara stood in the doorway, her honey-blonde hair partially covered by a simple kerchief, her sky-colored eyes widening in shock as she recognized him despite his plain clothing. She wore a simple dress of undyed linen, an apron stained with what looked like plant matter, and her feet were bare against the packed earth floor of her cottage. For a moment, neither spoke. Ilara seemed frozen in place, her hand still on the door, her expression cycling rapidly through shock, fear, and something that might have been anger. Edmund found himself equally paralyzed, all his rehearsed speeches evaporating from his mind like morning mist. "Your Highness," Ilara finally managed, her voice tight with tension. She started to curtsy, then seemed to remember she was standing in her own doorway, and stopped the motion halfway through, resulting in an awkward half-bow. This is unexpected. How may I serve you?" "May I come in?" Edmund asked, then immediately cursed himself. That had come out as a command rather than a request, exactly what he had not intended. I would like to speak with you, if you are willing. I promise I mean you no harm." Ilara's eyes narrowed slightly. "Forgive me, Your Highness, but your promises of no harm ring somewhat hollow given our last encounter." The words were direct enough to border on insolence, but Edmund found himself respecting rather than resenting them. She had courage, this healer woman, to speak so frankly to someone who could destroy her with a word. "You have every right to be suspicious and angry," he said quietly, "but I ask you to hear me out. Please." Something in his tone must have convinced her because after a moment's hesitation, Ilara stepped back and gestured for him to enter. The cottage's interior was small but meticulously clean. A table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the main room. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with mingled scents of lavender, sage, and rosemary. A large fireplace dominated one wall, a pot suspended over the flames emitting the smell of vegetable broth. Simple shelves held jars and bottles of various preparations, each carefully labeled in neat handwriting. Edmund removed his hood, feeling suddenly too large for the small space. He had to duck slightly to avoid the hanging herbs, and when he straightened, his head nearly brushed the low ceiling. Ilara had moved to stand behind her work table, putting the furniture between them like a barrier. "Why are you here?" she asked directly, her arms crossed over her chest. "Have you come to ensure I am properly suffering from your punishment? To add some new torment to my difficulties?" "No." Edmund took a breath, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I came to apologize. What I did to you in the market square was unjust and cruel. You stumbled by accident, and I punished you as if you had deliberately insulted me. It was wrong, and I am sorry." Ilara stared at him as if he had suddenly spoken in a foreign language. "You are apologizing. The Crown Prince is apologizing to me." "I am." Edmund's hands clenched at his sides. This was harder than he had anticipated, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "I have spent the past several days thinking about that incident, about what I did and why. I was irritated by a minor delay, and I took that irritation out on you without consideration for the consequences. That was not justice. That was petty tyranny. And this sudden conscience, this realization of wrongdoing, what prompted it?" Ilara's voice carried an edge of bitterness. "Did you lie awake at night troubled by guilt? Or did someone point out that your behavior was excessive?" "Both, in truth." Edmund moved slowly toward the table, careful not to appear threatening. "My father suggested I had been harsh, but more than that, I could not stop thinking about your face, about the way you stood there watching your livelihood being destroyed. It troubled me. It troubles me still." Ilara laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "How very noble of you to be troubled. Meanwhile, I face eviction from my home in 2 weeks because I cannot pay my rent. I have scoured this entire town looking for work and found nothing. Your troubles, Your Highness, are somewhat less pressing than mine." The words hit Edmund like physical blows. He had known intellectually that his actions had serious consequences, but hearing them laid out so starkly brought the reality home with brutal clarity. 2 weeks, he repeated. Your landlord will not grant you more time. Why should he? I am just another tenant to him, easily replaced. Ilara's composure was beginning to crack, her voice rising with emotion she had been holding back. Do you understand what you have done to me? This cottage was my mother's. Before her it belonged to my grandmother. It is all I have left of them, all I have in this world, and I am going to lose it because I had the misfortune to stumble in front of your horse. Edmund felt the weight of her words settle in his chest like stones. He had been so focused on his own discomfort, his own guilt, that he had not fully grasped the human cost of his action. I will speak to your landlord. I will ensure you are not evicted. No. The word was sharp and definitive. Ilara's eyes flashed with anger. I do not want your intervention. I do not want to be another peasant saved by royal charity, pitied and helped because the crown prince felt momentarily guilty. That is not justice. That is just another form of control. Then what do you want? Edmund's own frustration was beginning to rise. I'm trying to make this right. Tell me what you want from me. I want my mother back. Ilara's voice broke on the words, tears spilling down her cheeks despite her obvious effort to hold them back. I want to not be alone in this world. I want to not have to fight for every scrap of survival. I want to live in a world where powerful men do not casually destroy the lives of those beneath them because of a moment's inconvenience. But since you cannot give me any of that, Your Highness, I want you to leave me alone and let me face my problems without your interference. Edmund stood frozen, watching her cry, feeling more helpless than he had ever felt in his privileged life. Every instinct told him to fix this, to use his power and resources to solve her problems. But she had just told him clearly that was not what she wanted, that such intervention would only make things worse. I cannot leave you to face eviction knowing I caused it, he said finally. My conscience will not allow it, even if my help offends your pride. My pride? Ilara wiped at her tears with rough, angry movements. You think this is about pride? This is about dignity, Your Highness. This is about not becoming a charity case, a story people tell about the poor herb woman who had to be rescued by the prince who wronged her. I have lost enough without losing my self-respect as well. Edmund moved around the table before he could stop himself, closing the distance between them. Ilara tensed, but did not retreat, her chin lifting in defiance even as tears continued to streak her face. Up close he could see the fine details he had missed in the market square, the small scar on her left eyebrow, the unusual pattern of gold and gray in her blue eyes, the way her lips pressed together when she was trying not to show weakness. Then help me understand, he said quietly. What can I do that would not offend your dignity? What would actually help rather than simply assuaging my guilt? Ilara was silent for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to determine his sincerity. Reverse your judgment, she said finally. Publicly admit you were wrong and allow me to return to the market. That would be justice, not charity. I cannot do that. The words came out more harshly than Edmund intended, and he saw Ilara's expression harden. Not because I do not want to, but because such a reversal would undermine my authority in ways that would have consequences far beyond this situation. If I publicly reverse a judgment every time I regret it, I become seen as weak and indecisive. That creates instability that affects the entire realm. Of course, heaven forbid the crown prince appear weak by admitting he made a mistake. Ilara's voice dripped with scorn. Better that I lose everything than you suffer a momentary embarrassment. It is not about embarrassment. Edmund's own control was slipping, his voice rising to match hers. It is about maintaining the structures that keep this realm functioning. You think I enjoy these constraints? You think I want to be bound by considerations of appearance and political necessity? But I am because that is what leadership requires. Then you should have thought about that before you abused your power. Ilara shouted back, all pretense of deference abandoned. You should have considered consequences before you punished me. You do not get to claim the burdens of leadership as an excuse for escaping the consequences of your own cruelty. They stood facing each other, both breathing hard, the small cottage seeming to crackle with the intensity of their emotions. Edmund realized with a start that no one had ever spoken to him like this, had ever challenged him so directly, or refused to accept his explanations. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. You are right, he said, forcing his voice to calm. You are absolutely right. I made the choice to punish you harshly. I do not get to hide behind the constraints of my position to avoid fixing what I broke. So I will ask you again, what would help? Not what would make this perfect, not what would erase what happened, but what would actually practically help you survive the next 2 weeks. Alara turned away from Edmund, her shoulders trembling with the effort of holding back more tears. She moved to the small window that looked out toward the forest, her hands gripping the rough wooden sill. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions and impossible situations. Edmund waited, forcing himself not to fill the quiet with more words, more explanations, more justifications. Finally, Alara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to pay my rent. That is the immediate crisis. Beyond that, I need to rebuild my stores of herbs and remedies so that when the month is over, I can return to the market with something to sell. But gathering and preparing plants takes time, and time is what I do not have. Edmund's mind raced through possibilities. How much is your rent? 3 silver crowns. The amount was insignificant to him, a sum he might spend on a single meal without thought. But he could see from the way Alara's voice caught that to her, it represented weeks of careful saving, of going without comforts, of choosing between necessities. I can provide that amount easily, Edmund said, but you have already said you do not want my charity. It would not be charity if I earned it. Alara turned to face him, her expression thoughtful, despite her obvious emotional exhaustion. You said you wanted to help. Very well. I need assistance gathering herbs from the forest, preparing remedies, tasks that would normally take me weeks to complete alone. If you were to help me with this work, I would be earning the money through labor, not receiving it as a handout. Edmund stared at her, certain he had misheard. You want me to help you gather herbs? To work as your assistant? You asked what would help. That is what would help. Ilara's chin lifted in challenge. Unless the crown prince is too refined to get his hands dirty with actual labor. The comment stung, but Edmund recognized it for what it was. A test. She was daring him to refuse, to prove that his talk of making amends was just empty words. And perhaps part of her hoped he would refuse, that he would demonstrate he was exactly the privileged, callous noble she believed him to be. I accept, Edmund said, surprising himself as much as her. Tell me what needs to be done, and I will do it. Alara's eyes widened slightly, as if she had not truly expected him to agree. You cannot be serious. You are the crown prince. You have never done a day's real work in your life. Then it is past time I learned, Edmund said firmly. When do we start? For a moment, something shifted in Alara's expression. The anger and bitterness did not disappear, but they were joined by something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest hint of respect. Now, if you are truly willing. We have already wasted half the day and there is much to be done. She moved to a shelf and began gathering items. A woven basket, several cloth bags, a small knife with a worn wooden handle, a length of rope. She handed the basket to Edmund, who took it awkwardly, having never carried such a thing in his life. Alara pulled on a pair of well-worn leather boots and wrapped a heavier cloak around her shoulders. The forest can be treacherous for those who do not know it, she said as they stepped outside. Stay close and do exactly as I tell you. I will not be responsible for explaining to the king how his heir broke his neck falling into a ravine while playing at being a peasant. I am not playing, Edmund said quietly. I am trying to help. There is a difference. Alara glanced at him, her expression unreadable, then began walking toward the tree line. Edmund followed, acutely aware of how different this was from his usual forays into the forest. When he hunted, he rode through on horseback, surrounded by attendants and guards, pursuing carefully managed game in designated areas. This was something else entirely, stepping into the wild places where nature had not been tamed or organized for noble convenience. The forest was dense with ancient oaks and ash trees, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns of light and shadow. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and moss, and the air smelled of earth and growing things. Alara moved through it with the confidence of long familiarity, her steps sure even on uneven ground. Edmund tried to match her pace and found himself stumbling more than once, catching himself on tree trunks and low branches. Watch where you step, Alara said without turning around. There are roots and holes everywhere. A twisted ankle out here could be serious. Edmund paid closer attention to the ground, noticing details he had never observed before. The way certain areas were darker and damper, suggesting hidden streams beneath the surface. The subtle trails worn by deer and other animals. The difference between solid ground and soft spots that might give way beneath his weight. Ilara stopped beside a fallen log covered in pale mushrooms. She knelt beside it, examining the fungi with careful attention. "These are useful for treating infections," she explained, beginning to carefully cut them free from the wood. "But they must be harvested properly. Too rough and they bruise, which reduces their potency. Too much of the stem and they are difficult to dry correctly." She demonstrated the technique, her movements practiced and precise. Edmund watched, then attempted to copy her actions with the next mushroom. His cut was clumsy, the stem ragged, and Ilara shook her head. "Like this," she said, guiding his hand to show the proper angle. "Firm, but gentle. The knife should do the work, not force." Edmund tried again, this time producing a cleaner cut. Ilara nodded approval and moved on to the next cluster. They worked in silence for several minutes, filling one of the cloth bags with mushrooms. Edmund found himself absorbed in the task, focusing on getting each cut right, on matching Ilara's efficiency. "Why did you become a healer?" he asked as they moved deeper into the forest, following a nearly invisible path. "I did not become one. I was born into it." Ilara pushed aside a low-hanging branch, holding it so Edmund could pass. "My mother was a healer, as was her mother before her. They taught me everything they knew, from the time I could walk. It was never a choice, simply who I was always going to be. And if you had been able to choose something else?" Ilara was quiet for a moment, considering. "I do not know. I have never thought about it. Healing is not just what I do. It is who I am. The knowledge of plants, of remedies, of how to help people when they are suffering. It is woven into me as surely as the color of my eyes or the sound of my voice." They came to a stream, its water clear and cold, running over smooth stones. Ilara knelt beside it and began examining the plants growing along its banks. "Watercress," she said, indicating a cluster of green leaves. "Excellent for cleansing the blood and treating coughs. We need to gather it carefully, leaving enough to regrow." Edmund knelt beside her, his fine boots sinking into the soft mud at the water's edge. He had worn expensive boots hunting in worse conditions, but somehow getting them dirty while kneeling in a stream bed to harvest watercress felt different. More real, perhaps. More meaningful. "Tell me about your mother," he said as they worked. Ilara's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their careful harvesting. She was kind, patient. She never turned anyone away who needed help, even if they could not pay. Sometimes that meant we went hungry, but she said healing was a calling, not just a trade. Her voice softened with memory. She had the most beautiful voice. She would sing while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her. Sometimes when I am preparing remedies, I catch myself humming those same melodies. How did she die? Of fever. Ironic, is it not? A healer who could cure others but could not save herself. Ilara sat back on her heels, staring at the flowing water. I tried everything I knew. Every remedy, every treatment. Nothing worked. She just grew weaker and weaker until one morning she did not wake up. Edmund heard the grief in her voice, still raw despite 3 years having passed. "I am sorry. I lost my mother as well, though I was young when it happened. 7 years old. She died giving birth to my sister. At least you had others to help you through it. Family, servants, a whole castle full of people." Ilara's tone was not accusatory, simply stating fact. I had no one. And suddenly I was alone, responsible for everything, with no idea how to manage. Yet you have managed. You have survived 3 years on your own, built a reputation as a skilled healer, maintained your mother's cottage and her legacy. Edmund looked at her with genuine admiration. That takes considerable strength. Ilara met his eyes, and for the first time since he had arrived at her cottage, her expression held something other than anger or suspicion, strength or stubbornness. Sometimes I am not certain there is a difference. They continued gathering plants as the afternoon wore on. Edmund learned to identify feverfew by its small white flowers, to distinguish between edible and poisonous berries, to recognize the subtle differences between plants that looked similar but had vastly different properties. His back began to ache from bending and kneeling. His hands, unused to such work despite his training with weapons, started to develop small cuts and scrapes from thorns and rough bark. Alara noticed him examining a particularly deep scratch on his palm and shook her head. You need gloves. Those soft hands of yours were not made for this kind of work. They will toughen, Edmund said, closing his fist to hide the injury. Or they will become infected, and then you will be of no use to anyone. Alara pulled a small jar from her bag and opened it, revealing a pale green salve. Give me your hand. Edmund extended his palm, and Alara began applying the ointment with gentle fingers. Her touch was impersonal and professional, but Edmund found himself acutely aware of it nonetheless. Her hands, though roughened by work, were surprisingly gentle, her movements careful and precise. What is in this? He asked, more to break the sudden tension he felt than from genuine curiosity. Comfrey root, beeswax and oil infused with calendula flowers. It prevents infection and speeds healing. Alara finished with his palm and moved to treat a scratch on his wrist he had not even noticed. My mother's recipe. One of dozens she taught me. You must miss her terribly. Every day. Alara's voice was soft, especially when something happens and my first thought is to tell her about it. Then I remember she is gone, and it is like losing her all over again. Edmund understood that feeling more than he could easily express. Sometimes he still found himself thinking of things he wanted to ask his mother, questions about her life or her thoughts on his struggles, before remembering she had been gone for 18 years. They worked until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. Edmund's basket was full of various plants, and Alara's bags were stuffed with herbs, roots, and fungi. His body ached in ways he had never experienced before. Sword practice was demanding, but this was different. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that came from hours of constant motion and concentration. When they finally emerged from the forest near Alara's cottage, Edmund stumbled on a route he would have easily avoided earlier in the day. Alara caught his arm, steadying him, and for a moment they stood close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, could smell the scent of herbs and forest that clung to her hair. You did well, Alara said, releasing his arm and stepping back. Better than I expected, truthfully. Most nobles would have given up within an hour. I am not most nobles, Edmund said, then immediately regretted how arrogant it sounded. But Alara did not seem offended. No, she agreed thoughtfully. I am beginning to think you are not. Inside the cottage, Alara lit candles against the gathering darkness and set about preparing a simple meal. Edmund watched as she moved around her small space with easy efficiency, slicing bread, ladling broth into wooden bowls, setting out cheese and dried fruit. It was humbling to realize how much work went into even the simplest meal when there were no servants to do it for you. Sit, Alara commanded, gesturing to one of the chairs. You look ready to collapse. Edmund sat gratefully, his legs trembling with fatigue. Alara placed a bowl of broth before him along with bread and cheese. The meal was simple, nothing like the elaborate feasts he was accustomed to, but when he tasted the broth, he found it surprisingly flavorful, rich with vegetables and herbs. This is excellent, he said with genuine appreciation. It is peasant food, Alara said dismissively, sitting across from him with her own bowl. Nothing fancy, just what I could grow in my garden and forage from the forest. Sometimes simple is better than elaborate. Edmund broke off a piece of bread, noticing how his hands shook slightly from exhaustion. At the castle, we have courses upon courses of rich foods, each more complex than the last. By the end of a formal dinner, I often feel overfull and unsatisfied at the same time. Alara studied him over the rim of her bowl. You are not at all what I expected. What did you expect? Someone completely disconnected from reality. Someone who could not comprehend that actions have consequences for people beyond himself. She set down her bowl. Someone incapable of admitting fault or learning from mistakes. And now? Now I think you are someone who has lived in a cage of privilege and is only beginning to understand how limited your view of the world has been. Alara's words were blunt but not unkind. You are trying to change, I think. Whether you will succeed is another question. Edmund had no response to that. They finished their meal in silence, and when they were done, Alara began the process of preparing the day's harvest. She showed Edmund how to clean the roots, how to bundle herbs for drying, how to sort mushrooms by size and quality. The work was meticulous and time-consuming, requiring patience and attention to detail. As they worked, Edmund found himself telling Alara things he had never told anyone, about the pressure of being crown prince, of knowing that every decision he made was scrutinized and judged, about his father's expectations and the weight of living up to a legacy of strong kings, about his sister, who he barely knew despite sharing blood, about the loneliness of power, of being surrounded by people yet feeling fundamentally alone. Alara listened without comment, her hands never stopping their work. When he finally fell silent, she said quietly, "Loneliness is not unique to royalty. I have been lonely every day since my mother died. The difference is that you choose your isolation to maintain power and dignity. I have no such choice." The observation stung because it was true. Edmund had erected walls around himself, had maintained distance from others, had prioritized duty and appearance over genuine human connection. And he had done so willingly, believing it was necessary, never questioning whether there might be another way. "How do you bear it?" he asked. "The loneliness? The struggle? The constant uncertainty?" "Because I have no other option." Alara's hand stilled, and she looked at him directly. "You ask that question as if survival is a choice. It is not. Every morning I wake up and face another day because the alternative is giving up and dying. It is that simple and that complicated." Edmund thought about his own morning routine, servants helping him dress, meals prepared to his liking, his day structured around duties that, while demanding, were never about simple survival. He had never once woken up wondering if he would eat that day, if he would have shelter that night, if he would survive the week. The gulf between their experiences was vast, and no amount of philosophical conversation could bridge it. "Tomorrow I will come back," he said. "We will continue this work until you have enough to pay your rent and rebuild your stores." "And then what?" Alara challenged. "You return to your castle and your privileged life, and I return to scratching out a living until the next disaster strikes? Do you think a few days of playing peasant will somehow balance what you did to me?" "No," Edmund admitted. "Nothing can balance that, but it is a start, and perhaps—" He hesitated, uncertain how to articulate what he was feeling. "Perhaps it is a start to something more than just making amends." "What do you mean?" Edmund stood, moving to the window where he could see the last light fading from the sky. "I mean that meeting you, seeing how you live, understanding the consequences of my actions in a way I never have before. It is changing how I see the world. And once you see things differently, you cannot go back to seeing them the old way." Edmund returned to Thornwood Castle well after dark, his body aching and his mind churning with thoughts he could not easily organize. Geoffrey met him in the stables, concern etched across his weathered face as he took in the prince's disheveled appearance. Mud-stained boots, scratched hands, leaves clinging to his cloak, and an expression of exhaustion that came from genuine physical labor. "Your Highness, are you injured? Should I summon the physician?" "I am fine, Geoffrey. Just tired." Edmund dismounted with less grace than usual, his legs protesting the movement. "Has my father asked after me? King Harold was informed of your note and seemed satisfied with your explanation of needing time for contemplation. However, he expects you at breakfast tomorrow to discuss the arrangements for Lady Sophia's departure." Geoffrey's tone was carefully neutral, but Edmund detected the question beneath it. "I will be there." Edmund started toward the castle, then paused. "Geoffrey, I will need the same clothes and horse prepared for tomorrow morning, early, before the household is fully awake." Geoffrey's eyebrows rose, but he simply bowed. "As you wish, Your Highness." Edmund made his way to his chambers, where a bath had been prepared. Geoffrey's efficiency never failed. He sank into the hot water with a groan of relief, feeling his muscles slowly unknot as the heat penetrated his aching body. As he soaked, his mind returned to Alara's cottage, to the way she had moved through the forest with such confidence, to the simple meal they had shared, to the conversations that had revealed more about himself than he had intended. He had meant to help her out of guilt, to assuage his conscience and return to his normal life with a clearer mind. But something had shifted during those hours in the forest. He had glimpsed a world he had never truly understood, had been challenged in ways that had nothing to do with swordplay or political maneuvering, had met someone who saw him not as a prince, but as a man who had wronged her and needed to make it right. Sleep came fitfully that night. Edmund's dreams were filled with images of forests and herbs, of sky-colored eyes that saw through his pretensions, of a small cottage that somehow felt more real than all the grandeur of Thornwood Castle. He woke before dawn, as he had instructed Geoffrey he would, and dressed quickly in the simple clothes that had been laid out. The castle was quiet as he made his way to the stables, encountering only servants beginning their morning duties, who bowed and stepped aside without question. Within an hour, he was riding back toward Ashford, the morning mist clinging to the ground and muffling the sound of his horse's hooves. Ilara was already awake when he arrived at her cottage, a fire burning in the hearth and the smell of porridge filling the small space. She looked surprised to see him, as if part of her had not believed he would actually return. "You came back," she said, stating the obvious because she seemed unable to think of anything else to say. "I said I would." Edmund dismounted, tying his horse to a post near the cottage. "I keep my word, Ilara." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Come in. You should eat before we begin. Yesterday's work was only the start. Today will be harder." They ate quickly, simple porridge sweetened with honey, and then Ilara led him not into the forest but to a small shed behind her cottage that Edmund had not noticed the previous day. Inside were tools for processing plants, grinding stones, drying racks, a small press for extracting oils, various knives, and cutting implements. "The gathering is only half the work," Ilara explained, gesturing to the bundles of herbs they had collected yesterday. "Now comes the preparation. These need to be cleaned, sorted, dried, and in some cases ground or pressed into various forms. It is tedious work that requires patience and precision." She was not exaggerating. Edmund spent the next several hours learning to strip leaves from stems without damaging them, to cut roots into uniform pieces for even drying, to operate the grinding stone with steady circular motions that produced fine powder rather than chunks. His hands, already sore from yesterday, began to blister. His back ached from bending over the work table. His eyes stung from the strong scents of some of the more pungent herbs, but he persisted, driven by something more than guilt now. There was satisfaction in seeing the piles of prepared materials grow, in learning to recognize when something was done correctly versus when it needed more work. And there was something else too, something he was only beginning to acknowledge. He enjoyed being near Ilara, enjoyed listening to her explain the properties of different plants, enjoyed the rare moments when she forgot to be angry with him and simply shared her knowledge with genuine enthusiasm. "My mother used to say that every plant has a purpose," Ilara said as they worked side by side, grinding dried feverfew into powder. "Even the ones that seem useless or harmful often have hidden benefits if you know how to use them properly." She saw healing in everything. "That is a beautiful philosophy," Edmund observed, adjusting his grip on the grinding stone as Ilara had shown him. "It is also practical. When you are poor, you cannot afford to waste anything. You learn to see value where others see only weeds and refuse." Ilara paused in her work, looking at him thoughtfully. "What do you see when you look at the people in your realm, Your Highness? Do you see their value, or do you see them as simply part of the landscape, like trees or stones?" The question cut deeper than she perhaps intended. Edmund stopped grinding, considering his answer carefully. "I see them as subjects, as people whose welfare is my responsibility, but whose individual lives are largely invisible to me. Until recently, I would have said that was simply the nature of ruling. You cannot know everyone personally, so you create systems and structures to ensure their needs are met collectively. And now I realize how inadequate that is. Systems and structures can ensure basic survival, perhaps, but they cannot address individual suffering. They cannot see Ilara the healer, only peasants who need grain and shelter." Edmund met her eyes. "Meeting you has made the invisible visible. I do not know if I can maintain that clarity when I return to my normal life, but I know I must try." Ilara was quiet for a long moment, then returned to her work. "You speak well, I will grant you that. But words are easy, Your Highness. Actions are what matter." They worked through the afternoon, breaking only for a brief meal of bread and cheese. Edmund learned to bundle herbs for maximum airflow during drying, to test the consistency of ground powders, to properly seal jars to preserve their contents. His hands moved with increasing confidence as the hours passed, though they also grew increasingly painful. When Ilara noticed him trying to hide a particularly nasty blister on his thumb, she took his hand in hers and examined it with a frown. "This needs to be treated before it becomes infected. Come inside." In the cottage, she made him sit while she prepared a poultice from comfrey and honey. Her touch as she applied it was gentle and efficient, her fingers cool against his inflamed skin. Edmund found himself watching her face as she worked. noting the small furrow of concentration between her eyebrows, the way she bit her lower lip when focusing intently, the loose strand of honey blonde hair that had escaped her kerchief and fallen across her cheek. "You were staring," Ilara said without looking up from her work. "I apologize. I was simply thinking how skilled you are at this, how much knowledge and training goes into what you do. Years of practice and instruction." Ilara finished wrapping his thumb in a clean cloth. "My mother started teaching me before I could read. By the time I was 10, I could identify every common plant in these forests, and most of their uses. By 15, I was assisting with complex cases, treating serious injuries and illnesses. When she died, I already knew enough to continue her work, though there is still so much I am learning on my own. Do you ever wish you could study with other healers? Learn techniques and remedies from beyond this region?" Ilara's expression turned wistful. "Sometimes. I have heard there are universities where men study medicine from ancient texts, where they learn from masters who have traveled the world gathering knowledge. But such education is not for women like me. We learn from our mothers and grandmothers, passing down what we know, but we have no access to the broader world of learning. That seems an enormous waste of potential talent. Perhaps. But that is the world we live in." Ilara released his hand and began putting away her supplies. "You are born into your circumstances and you make the best of them. Some of us have more options than others." Edmund wanted to argue, to suggest that circumstances could be changed, that she could have access to better education if he intervened. But he caught himself, remembering her earlier rejection of his offers to fix her problems. Instead, he asked, "What would you study if you could? What knowledge do you most wish you had?" Ilara's face lit up with genuine excitement, transforming her features. "Everything about diseases of the blood and organs, how to recognize them early, how to treat them more effectively. My mother died of a fever, but I think there was something deeper wrong, something affecting her blood or her liver or her lungs. If I had known more, if I had understood better what was happening inside her body, perhaps I could have saved her." The pain in her voice was raw and immediate, grief that had not diminished with time. Edmund understood that pain, the helpless fury of losing someone you loved to something you could not control or prevent. His mother had died the same way, her body failing in a process no physician could stop or even fully explain. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for your loss, and for the unfairness of a world that would deny you the education that might have prevented it." Ilara looked at him with surprise, as if his genuine sympathy had caught her off guard. "Thank you," she said softly. That means something." They returned to work, but something had shifted between them. The antagonism that had characterized their earlier interactions had softened into something more complex. Ilara still challenged him, still questioned his assumptions, and called out his privilege, but there was less anger in it now, more genuine curiosity about who he was beneath the trappings of royalty. As the sun began to set on their second day of working together, Ilara tallied up what they had accomplished. "We have enough prepared medicines to sell for 2 silver crowns, perhaps 3 if I am fortunate in my pricing. Combined with what I had remaining from before, that gives me almost enough for rent. How much more do you need?" "Another half-day's work should do it, maybe a full day to be safe." Ilara looked at him with an expression that might have been reluctant gratitude. "You have helped more than I expected, Your Highness. I admit I thought you would give up after an hour or 2 yesterday. I am more stubborn than I appear," Edmund said with a slight smile. "That is becoming apparent." Ilara moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening forest. "You should return to your castle before full dark. The roads are not safe at night, even for a prince." Edmund knew she was right, but he found himself reluctant to leave. The cottage, despite its simplicity, had become a refuge of sorts, a place where he could be simply Edmund rather than Crown Prince, where his worth was measured by the quality of his work rather than his birthright. "I will return tomorrow," he said, moving toward the door. "We will finish what we started." Edmund. The use of his name rather than his title stopped him. Ilara had never called him by name before. "Why are you really doing this? And do not tell me it is just guilt or obligation. I think there is something more." He turned to face her, considering how to answer truthfully without revealing more than he was ready to acknowledge even to himself. "Because being here, working with you, I feel more real than I have in years. Because you see me clearly, without the filter of power and position, and that is both terrifying and liberating. Because I think you are remarkable. and I want to understand how you survive in a world that gives you so little while taking so much." Alara's eyes widened at his honesty. "That is more than I expected you to say. You asked for truth. I am trying to give it to you, even when it makes me vulnerable." Edmund held her gaze. "I am tired of performing, Alara. Tired of being what everyone expects, rather than who I actually am. Here, with you, I can simply be. That is worth more than I can easily express." The silence that followed was charged with emotions neither seemed ready to name. Finally, Alara nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, then. Come early. We have much to do." Edmund rode back to Thornwood Castle through the gathering darkness, his mind full of Alara's face, her voice, the way she had looked at him when he spoke of wanting to simply be, rather than perform. Geoffrey was waiting again, and this time Edmund saw something knowing in the older man's expression. "A productive day, Your Highness?" "Very productive," Edmund confirmed, allowing Geoffrey to take his horse. "Same arrangements for tomorrow, please." "Of course. Though I feel compelled to mention that your father has been asking more pointed questions about your activities. He is not a fool, and he knows you well enough to sense when something significant is occurring." Edmund sighed. He had known he could not keep his trips to Ashford secret indefinitely. "I will speak with him soon, but not yet. Not until I have finished what I started." In his chambers that night, Edmund found himself unable to settle. He paced the length of his room, his thoughts circling endlessly around Alara. He thought about her strength, her intelligence, her refusal to accept charity or pity. He thought about the way she had looked when speaking of her mother. Grief and love intertwined so completely they could not be separated. He thought about her hands as she had treated his blistered thumb, gentle and skilled, and the brief moment when their eyes had met and something had passed between them, something neither had acknowledged but both had felt. This was dangerous territory. He was the crown prince, expected to make a politically advantageous marriage to strengthen the realm. She was a peasant healer with no family, no connections, no dowry or lands to bring to an alliance. The gulf between their stations was not merely wide, it was insurmountable by every measure of law, custom, and practical governance. And yet, Edmund could not deny what he was beginning to feel. It went beyond guilt or obligation, beyond respect for her skills or admiration for her resilience. When he was with Alara, he felt seen in a way he never had before. She did not care about his title or his future crown. She cared about his actions, his character, whether he kept his word and treated her with genuine respect. With her, he could be honest without fear of that honesty being used against him politically. With her, he could admit doubt and uncertainty without appearing weak. The third morning dawned cold and gray, with clouds threatening rain. Edmund rode to Ashford earlier than before, arriving at Alara's cottage just as the first light touched the eastern sky. She was already outside, checking the drying racks they had set up the previous day, her breath visible in the chill air. "You look like you did not sleep," she observed as he dismounted. "I could say the same of you." Edmund noticed the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. "What troubles you?" Alara hesitated, then gestured for him to follow her inside. The cottage was warm from the fire she had built, and she poured him a cup of something hot that smelled of herbs and honey. "My landlord sent a message yesterday evening. He is coming tomorrow to collect the rent. If I cannot pay in full, he will require me to vacate immediately, not at the end of 2 weeks as he originally said. He is moving up the deadline?" Edmund felt anger rise in his chest. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that he can. I have no legal recourse, no protection against his whims." Alara's hands trembled slightly as she set down her own cup. "We have made good progress, but I am still short almost a full silver crown. Even if we work all day today, I do not know if I can prepare enough to make up the difference." Edmund's mind raced through possibilities. He could simply give her the money, but he knew she would refuse it. He could confront Sir Geoffrey and demand he honor his original timeline, but that would reveal Edmund's involvement and likely make things worse for Alara once he left. There had to be another solution. "What if you sold directly to households instead of waiting for the market?" he suggested. "Take what you have prepared and offer it to people who need it now. That might bring in the additional funds more quickly." Alara shook her head. "Going door-to-door selling is seen as desperate, almost begging. It would damage my reputation, and most people prefer to buy at the market where they can compare prices and quality. Then we need to work faster and more efficiently." Edmund set down his cup with determination. Show me what tasks take the longest. Perhaps there are ways to speed the process. They spent the morning in intense, focused labor. Edmund worked the grinding stone while Alara bundled and sorted, both of them pushing themselves harder than before. His hands, still tender from previous blisters, developed new ones. His back screamed in protest at the constant bending and lifting. But he did not stop, driven by the knowledge that Alara's home depended on their success. Around midday, they heard the sound of a horse approaching. Both froze, and Alara moved to the window, her face going pale. "It is Sir Geoffrey. He said tomorrow, but he is here now." Edmund felt his heart rate spike. If the landlord saw him here, the questions and complications would be endless. But before he could decide what to do, Alara grabbed his arm. "The back room, quickly. Do not make a sound." She pushed him toward the small sleeping chamber and closed the door behind him. Edmund stood in the dim space, surrounded by Alara's few personal belongings. A narrow bed with a faded quilt, a small chest for her clothes, a shelf holding a few precious items that must have belonged to her mother. He pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear the conversation in the main room. "Sir Geoffrey," Alara's voice was carefully controlled. "I was not expecting you until tomorrow. Plans change, my dear." The landlord's voice was jovial, but edged with something unpleasant. "I thought I would save us both the trouble of dragging this out. Do you have my rent, or do you not?" "I have most of it, sir. I am still gathering the final amount, but I will have it all by tomorrow, as we agreed." Tomorrow was the old agreement. Today is the new one. Sir Geoffrey's footsteps moved around the room, and Edmund could hear him picking up items, examining them. "Let me see what you have." There was the sound of coins being counted. 2 silver crowns and some copper. "That is considerably short of 3 crowns, Mistress Alara." "I know, sir, but if you could just give me until tomorrow." "I could, but I will not. I have another tenant ready to take this property. Someone who can pay reliably and in full. A young couple, recently married, with the husband working at the mill. They are eager for a place of their own." Geoffrey's tone became almost sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. "You understand, it is simply business, nothing personal. This cottage is my home. It was my mother's home." Alara's voice cracked slightly. "Surely that must count for something." "Sentiment does not pay rent, my dear. I need you to vacate by tomorrow morning. You may take your personal belongings, of course, but the furniture and fixtures remain as they belong to the property." Edmund had heard enough. He pushed open the door and stepped into the main room, his anger overriding his caution. Sir Geoffrey spun around, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of a well-dressed young man emerging from Alara's sleeping chamber. "Who are you?" Geoffrey demanded, his face reddening. "What is the meaning of this?" Edmund drew himself up to his full height, letting his natural authority show. "I am someone who takes an interest in justice, Sir Geoffrey, and I find your treatment of Mistress Alara deeply unjust." "This is none of your concern, young man, whoever you are." Geoffrey's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "This is a private matter between landlord and tenant. It becomes my concern when you change agreements to suit your convenience, when you deny a woman her home for the sake of a few pieces of silver." Edmund took a step closer, and something in his bearing made Geoffrey step back instinctively. "You will honor your original timeline. Mistress Alara has until the end of 2 weeks to produce the full rent. That was your word, and a man's word should mean something." "My word?" Geoffrey sputtered, recovering some of his bluster. "I will not be lectured by some young fool found hiding in a woman's bedroom. Your presence here raises questions about Mistress Alara's character that may interest the whole town." Edmund felt Alara's hand on his arm, a silent plea for restraint, but he was past the point of caution. "You will not threaten her reputation. You will leave now, and you will return in 2 weeks for your rent. And if I hear that you have troubled Mistress Alara further or spread malicious gossip about her, you will find yourself answering to authorities far above your station." Something in Edmund's tone finally penetrated Geoffrey's indignation. The landlord looked at him more carefully, taking in the quality of his clothing, despite its simplicity, the way he carried himself, the unconscious command in his voice. "Just who are you?" "Someone you do not want as an enemy," Edmund said quietly. "Leave. Now." Geoffrey looked between Edmund and Alara, clearly calculating whether to press the confrontation. Finally, self-preservation won out. 2 weeks, he said stiffly. "But the rent will be 3.5 silver crowns now, not 3. Call it interest on the extension." Before Edmund could protest the additional charge, Alara spoke quickly. "Agreed. Thank you for your understanding, Sir Geoffrey." The landlord left, muttering under his breath. When the sound of his horse had faded, Alara turned to Edmund with an expression mixing gratitude and exasperation. That was foolish. You should not have revealed yourself. I could not stand there and listen to him bully you. Edmund ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself. But you are right. I may have made things worse. If he discovers who I am, then everyone will know the Crown Prince has been spending time alone with a peasant woman in her cottage. The scandal would be considerable. Alara moved to the window, watching to ensure Geoffrey had truly gone. Your reputation would survive it, mine would not. Edmund felt the weight of that truth. For him, this would be an embarrassing incident, perhaps fodder for court gossip, but nothing that would truly damage his position. For Alara, it could destroy what little standing she had in the community. I am sorry. I acted without thinking. You acted to defend me. I appreciate that, even if it was unwise. Alara turned back to face him, her expression softening. But now we have an even larger problem. 3.5 silver crowns in 2 weeks instead of 3 in the same time. We will need to work even harder. They returned to their labor with renewed urgency, but Edmund's mind was troubled. He had revealed too much of himself to Geoffrey, had acted with the arrogance of someone accustomed to having his commands obeyed. If the landlord started asking questions, if he described Edmund to the wrong people, the connection would be made quickly. As they worked through the afternoon, grinding and bundling and preparing remedies, Edmund found himself thinking about the impossible situation they were in. Every instinct told him to simply solve the problem with gold, to buy the cottage outright for Alara so she would never have to worry about rent again. But he knew she would refuse, knew it would feel like charity rather than earned security. There has to be another way, he said aloud, not really meaning to speak. Another way for what? Alara looked up from the herbs she was bundling. To help you. To solve this problem in a way that does not offend your dignity or compromise either of our positions. Edmund set down the grinding stone. What if I purchased your medicines? Not as charity, but as legitimate supplies for the castle? We have physicians, yes, but they could always use quality remedies. I could pay you fair market value, which would give you enough for rent and more. Alara considered this, her brow furrowed in thought. That would be a business transaction. Legitimate and fair if the price is truly market rate and not inflated out of pity. I swear to you I would pay exactly what these remedies are worth. Nothing more or less. Edmund felt a surge of hope. And there would be benefit to the castle as well. Our physicians often complain about the quality of materials available from their usual suppliers. Then we have a bargain, Your Highness. Alara extended her hand formally, and Edmund took it, sealing their agreement with a handshake that lasted slightly longer than necessary. They worked into the evening, preparing everything to the highest standard possible. As darkness fell, Alara lit candles and they continued by their flickering light, both too focused to stop. Finally, near midnight, they had assembled a collection of remedies that represented the best of Ilara's skill: perfectly ground powders, expertly mixed salves, carefully prepared tinctures and oils. Edmund examined the results with genuine admiration. This is remarkable work. Any physician would be fortunate to have access to such quality materials. It is my mother's legacy and mine, Alara said quietly. Every technique, every recipe, passed down through generations. When you take these to your castle, you carry with you the accumulated wisdom of healers who never had formal education, but who learned through observation, experimentation, and dedication. I will ensure they are used well, and that your skill is acknowledged. Edmund paused, then added, Alara, I need to tell you something. These past 3 days, working with you, learning from you, seeing the world through your eyes, it has changed me in ways I am still trying to understand. I came here to ease my guilt, but I am leaving with something far more significant. Alara met his eyes, and in the candlelight, her expression was open in a way he had not seen before. What is that? A connection to someone who sees me clearly and challenges me to be better. A friendship with someone who does not care about my title but cares deeply about my character. Edmund took a step closer, and feelings I have no right to have but cannot seem to prevent. Edmund. His name on her lips was soft, almost a whisper. You know this is impossible. You are the Crown Prince. I am a peasant healer. The difference in our stations is not merely large, it is absolute. I know. Believe me, I know. Edmund's hands clenched at his sides with frustration. I know that I am expected to marry someone of noble birth, someone who brings political advantage and strengthens alliances. I know that my father would never approve of me forming any attachment to someone outside the aristocracy. I know all the reasons why what I feel is impractical and impossible. And yet you feel it anyway. And yet I feel it anyway. Edmund's voice was raw with honesty. When I am with you, I feel more myself than I have ever felt. You see past the crown and the title to the man beneath, and that man is someone I am only beginning to discover. You have shown me a world I never knew existed, taught me lessons about strength and resilience that no courtly education could provide. How can I not care for someone who has given me such gifts? Ilara was silent for a long moment, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I care for you too, she admitted finally. I tried not to. I told myself you were just a privileged noble trying to ease his conscience, that once you had done your penance you would forget all about me. But you keep surprising me. You work without complaint. You listen when I speak. You treat me as an equal even though I am so far beneath you socially that we should barely acknowledge each other's existence. You are not beneath me in any way that matters. Edmund reached out and gently took her hand. In wisdom, in skill, in understanding what truly matters in life, you surpass me completely. Pretty words, but they do not change reality. Ilara did not pull her hand away, her fingers curling around his. What future could we possibly have? You cannot marry me. I cannot become part of your world. We are like birds of different species, drawn to each other but incapable of truly building a life together. Edmund knew she was right. Every practical consideration argued against any relationship between them. And yet, holding her hand in his, feeling the calluses earned through hard work, seeing the intelligence and strength in her eyes, he could not bring himself to simply walk away and forget her. I do not have answers, he said honestly. I do not know how to bridge the gulf between our worlds. But I know I cannot simply disappear from your life as if these days meant nothing. I know that meeting you has fundamentally altered how I see everything, and I cannot go back to who I was before. Then what do you propose we do? Ilara's voice was challenging but not unkind. I propose we acknowledge what we feel and deal honestly with the complications. I propose that I continue to visit when I can, that we build something real even if we cannot yet see what shape it will take. I propose we trust that two people of intelligence and goodwill can find a path forward even when the way is not clear. Edmund squeezed her hand gently. And I propose that we stop pretending this is simply about guilt and obligation when we both know it has become something more. Ilara searched his face, looking for something. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her because she nodded slowly. Very well. We will see where this leads, even though it terrifies me. But Edmund, you must promise me something. Anything. Do not make promises you cannot keep. Do not speak of futures that cannot exist. If this, whatever this is, must end because of your duties or my limitations, then let it end honestly. I would rather have painful truth than comfortable lies. I promise, Edmund said solemnly. I will never lie to you, Ilara, not even to protect you from difficult truths. They stood there in the candlelit cottage, hands joined, acknowledging feelings neither had planned, and a connection that defied all logic and social convention. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Inside, two people from impossibly different worlds had found something neither had expected, the possibility of understanding, respect, and perhaps something deeper. The rain began before dawn, a steady downpour that turned the roads to mud and kept most sensible people indoors. Edmund stood at the window of his chambers in Thornwood Castle, watching water stream down the glass panes, his mind far away in a small cottage on the edge of Ashford. He had returned late the previous night, the carefully wrapped remedies secured in his saddlebags, his heart heavy with emotions he could not easily name. Geoffrey had helped him carry the packages to the castle's still room, where the head physician, Master Aldrich, had examined them with growing excitement. The old man had held up jars and pouches, sniffing and testing, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. Your Highness, these are exceptional quality, far superior to what we typically receive from our suppliers. Where did you acquire them? From a healer in Ashford, Edmund had replied carefully. I happened upon her work and was impressed by her skill. I thought the castle might benefit from such expertise. Master Aldrich had nodded enthusiastically. Indeed we shall. If this healer can provide such quality consistently, I would very much like to establish a regular arrangement. He had paused, studying Edmund with knowing eyes. "Though I suspect your Highness's interest in this acquisition goes beyond simple procurement of medical supplies." Edmund had not responded to the implied question, simply ensuring that payment was arranged. 5 silver crowns, more than enough to cover Alara's rent with substantial funds remaining. He had written a brief note explaining the amount and asking Geoffrey to deliver both payment and a formal request for future supplies to Alara's cottage. Now, a day later, Edmund waited with barely concealed impatience for Geoffrey's return. The morning dragged on with excruciating slowness. He attended breakfast with his father, enduring King Harold's pointed observations about his recent distracted state. He met briefly with Lady Sophia before her departure, making polite conversation while his thoughts were elsewhere. He reviewed documents requiring his attention, signing them without truly reading their contents. Finally, near midday, Geoffrey appeared at his chambers, rain-soaked, but smiling. "The delivery has been made, Your Highness." The young woman was most grateful for the payment and surprised by the amount. "She asked me to convey her thanks and her willingness to provide further supplies as needed." "How did she seem?" Edmund asked before he could stop himself. Geoffrey's smile widened slightly. "She seemed well, Your Highness." "Relieved, certainly. The rain had trapped her indoors, so she was working on preparing more remedies when I arrived. She asked after your health and hoped the journey back to the castle had been safe." Edmund felt warmth spread through his chest at the knowledge that Alara had thought of him, had asked after his well-being. "Thank you, Geoffrey. Your discretion in this matter is appreciated." "Always, Your Highness." Geoffrey hesitated, then added carefully, "If I may speak freely, sir, the young woman strikes me as remarkable, intelligent, skilled, and possessed of a dignity that transcends her station. I can understand why she has captured your interest." Edmund looked at his loyal servant, seeing understanding rather than judgment in the older man's eyes. "It is complicated, Geoffrey. The best things usually are, Your Highness." Geoffrey bowed and withdrew, leaving Edmund alone with his thoughts. 3 days passed. Edmund threw himself into his duties with unusual intensity, as if constant activity might quiet the restless longing that had taken up residence in his chest. He met with counselors, reviewed petitions, trained with his weapons master, and attended formal dinners where he made appropriate conversation while feeling utterly disconnected from everything around him. On the 4th day, King Harold summoned him to the private solar. Edmund found his father standing by the window, his expression grave. "Sit down, Edmund. We need to discuss a serious matter." Edmund sat, his stomach knotting with apprehension. Had his father discovered his visits to Ashford? Had someone reported seeing the Crown Prince emerging from a peasant woman's cottage? "I have received word from Lord Chancellor Reginald," Harold began, turning to face his son. "There have been disturbing reports from Ashford. It seems the Crown Prince has been observed in the company of a common healer, visiting her cottage multiple times, emerging from her sleeping chambers, and engaging in behavior that raises questions about the nature of your relationship." Edmund's mind raced. Sir Geoffrey, the landlord. He must have made inquiries after their confrontation, must have described Edmund to someone who recognized the description. "Father, I can explain. I certainly hope you can." Harold's voice was sharp with controlled anger. "Because from where I stand, it appears my heir has been conducting an inappropriate liaison with a peasant woman, behavior that not only demeans your position but provides ammunition to anyone who might question your fitness to rule." "It is not a liaison, father. Not in the way you are implying." Edmund stood, facing his father directly. "I wronged this woman publicly. I punished her unjustly for an accident, banned her from the market, and threatened her survival. When I learned the consequences of my actions, I sought to make amends by helping her myself, rather than simply throwing gold at the problem." Harold's expression softened slightly. "A noble impulse, perhaps, but foolishly executed. You should have sent intermediaries, maintained proper distance. Instead, you compromised both your reputation and hers." "I know." Edmund's hands clenched at his sides. "But sending intermediaries would have been the coward's way. She deserved to see me face the consequences of my actions, to understand that I recognized my injustice personally. And in the process, you developed feelings for her. It was not a question." Harold moved to his desk, pouring wine for both of them. "Do not bother denying it. I can see it in your face every time her situation is mentioned. You care for this woman beyond simple guilt or obligation." Edmund accepted the wine but did not drink. "Yes, father, I care for her. She is remarkable, intelligent, skilled, strong in ways I never understood strength could manifest. She sees me clearly, without the filter of my title, and she has taught me more about leadership and responsibility in a few days than years of courtly education. I do not doubt she is admirable. Peasants are not lesser beings simply because they lack noble birth. They are simply different, with different roles and responsibilities in the order of society. Harold sat heavily in his chair. But that does not change the fundamental problem, Edmund. You cannot marry her. Even if I were to approve such a match, which I cannot, the nobility would revolt. The stability of the realm depends upon the crown maintaining alliances through strategic marriages. I know that, Father. Do you think I have not tortured myself with exactly that knowledge? Edmund's voice rose with frustration. I know my duty. I know what is expected of me. But I also know that what I feel for Alara is real and significant, and dismissing it simply because it is inconvenient seems a betrayal of everything genuine in my life. Harold was quiet for a long moment, studying his son with an expression Edmund could not read. You remind me of myself at your age, he said finally, so certain that passion and duty could somehow be reconciled, so convinced that the strength of your feelings could overcome practical obstacles. What happened to change your mind? I learned that ruling requires sacrifice, that personal happiness, while desirable, cannot take precedence over the welfare of the realm. Harold's voice carried the weight of old pain. I cared deeply for someone once, before I was married to your mother. A woman of minor nobility, unsuitable for a crown prince but perfect in every way that mattered to me personally. I was told I could not have her, that my marriage must serve the kingdom. I fought that decision bitterly. Edmund had never heard this story before. What happened? I did my duty. I married your mother, ended my relationship with the other woman, and focused on being the king the realm needed. Harold's eyes grew distant. Your mother and I developed genuine fondness over the years. She was a good queen and a good wife, but I would be lying if I said I never wondered what my life might have been if I had chosen differently. So you are telling me to let Alara go, to do my duty and marry whomever serves the realm best. I am telling you that such decisions have consequences either way. Harold met his son's eyes directly. If you pursue this attachment to Alara, you risk political instability, noble resentment, and possibly civil conflict if they believe their king is not acting in the realm's best interests. If you abandon her to marry strategically, you risk becoming the kind of ruler who places politics above humanity, who can rationalize any action as necessary for the greater good. Then what should I do? Edmund's voice was raw with confusion and pain. That, my son, is a decision only you can make. Harold stood and placed a hand on Edmund's shoulder. But whatever you decide, you must be prepared to live with all the consequences, both for yourself and for everyone affected by your choice. That is what it means to wield power. After leaving his father's solar, Edmund wandered the castle aimlessly, his mind churning. He found himself in the chapel, a small stone room with tall windows that let in colored light through stained glass depicting saints and biblical scenes. He was not particularly religious, but the quiet space offered refuge from the constant observation of court life. He knelt on the cold stone floor, not in prayer but simply in an attempt to still his racing thoughts. The fundamental problem was clear. He could not have both Alara and the crown, not in any way that would be acceptable to the realm he was meant to rule. Every solution he imagined created new problems. Every potential compromise seemed to serve no one. He could marry Alara in secret, but such a marriage would be invalid, and their children illegitimate. He could keep her as a mistress, but that would dishonor both of them and make her position even more precarious. He could abdicate his claim to the throne, but his father had made clear that was not an option, and it would throw the succession into chaos. He could marry someone suitable and keep Alara at a distance as a friend, but he knew such an arrangement would be torture for both of them. A voice spoke from behind him. "Brother, are you unwell?" Edmund turned to see Princess Victoria standing in the chapel doorway, concern evident in her expression. He had been so lost in thought he had not heard her enter. "I am well enough, Victoria, simply troubled by difficult decisions." She moved closer, settling onto the bench beside where he knelt. "Father told me about the situation in Ashford, about the healer woman." Edmund felt heat rise to his face. "He told you?" "I am not a child, Edmund. I am 18 and will likely face similar pressures regarding marriage soon enough. Father thought I should understand the realities you are facing. Victoria's expression was sympathetic. He says you care for her deeply. I do. There seemed no point in denying it. But it is an impossible situation. Perhaps not as impossible as you think. Victoria hesitated, then continued carefully. History is full of kings who found ways to honor both duty and their hearts. King Edward married for love and his reign prospered. King Henry kept the woman he loved close despite political marriages. The arrangements were unconventional, yes, but they were possible. And for every such example there are 10 others where such arrangements led to disaster, rebellion, and bloodshed. Edmund countered. I cannot risk the stability of the realm for my personal feelings. Can you rule effectively if you are perpetually miserable? Victoria challenged. A king who resents his position, who feels trapped and bitter, will make worse decisions than one who has found a way to be content. Perhaps the question is not whether you can have what you want, but how to find a way to have it that serves both your happiness and the realm's needs. Edmund looked at his sister with new appreciation. When did you become so wise? I pay attention, brother. I watch and I listen, even when people think I am simply decorative. Victoria smiled slightly. And I have seen how you have changed these past weeks. You are more engaged, more present, more genuinely interested in governance than you have ever been. Whatever this woman has awakened in you, it seems to be making you a better potential king, not a worse one. That evening Edmund made a decision. He could not continue in this state of paralysis, caught between duty and desire. He needed to see Alara, to speak with her honestly about their situation, to make decisions together rather than agonizing alone. He summoned Geoffrey and gave him a message to deliver to Ashford. The next day, as the sun reached its zenith, Edmund rode once more to Alara's cottage. She was waiting outside, her expression wary but hopeful. They stood facing each other for a long moment before Edmund spoke. My father knows about us, about my visits here, about my feelings for you. Alara's face went pale. What did he say? That I cannot marry you. That such a union would threaten the stability of the realm and my ability to rule effectively. Edmund stepped closer. He is right, Alara. Every practical consideration argues against us. The nobility would never accept a peasant queen. Our children would face constant challenges to their legitimacy. The political alliances I am expected to form through marriage would be lost. Then you have come to say goodbye. Alara's voice was steady, but Edmund could see tears gathering in her eyes. To tell me that duty must prevail over feeling. No, the word came out with surprising force. I have come to ask you something I have no right to ask. Something that may be the most selfish request anyone has ever made. What is that? Edmund took both her hands in his. Marry me, Alara. Not in secret, not as a shameful thing to be hidden, but openly and honestly. Be my wife and my partner, my queen and my conscience. Help me become the kind of ruler this realm truly needs. One who understands that power exists to serve people, not the other way around. Alara stared at him in shock. Edmund, you just said such a marriage is impossible, that it would threaten everything you are meant to protect. I said it would be difficult and unconventional. But I have been thinking about what my sister said, about how effective governance requires more than just political calculation. It requires humanity, compassion, the ability to see people as individuals rather than abstract subjects. Edmund squeezed her hands gently. You have taught me those things, Alara. With you beside me, I believe I could be the kind of king this realm deserves. Without you, I fear I will become exactly the kind of distant, callous ruler who cares more about power than people. The nobility will fight you on this. They will see it as an insult, a diminishment of their own status. Let them. I will spend whatever political capital necessary to make them accept it. And if they cannot, if they choose to rebel rather than accept a queen who was born a commoner, then perhaps this realm needs a reckoning about what truly matters. Edmund's voice was fierce with conviction. I am tired of a system that values birth over character, that measures worth by titles and lands rather than intelligence and integrity. You are worth 10 of any noble lady I might marry for political advantage. Alara pulled her hands free and turned away, her shoulders shaking. You are asking me to step into a world that will despise me, to take on responsibilities I was never trained for, to face constant scrutiny and criticism from people who will believe I do not belong. Do you understand what you are asking? I am asking you to be brave with me, to face those challenges together rather than separately. Edmund moved to stand behind her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence. I am asking you to believe that we can create something new, something better than the tired old patterns of strategic marriages and political alliances. I am asking you to trust that what we feel is worth fighting for. Alara was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I am terrified. So am I, Edmund admitted, but I am more terrified of living without you, of becoming the kind of man who chooses safety and convention over truth and love. She turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. If I say yes, everything changes. Not just for us, but for everyone. Are you truly prepared for that? I am. Edmund cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You have awakened something in me that I did not know was sleeping. You have shown me what it means to truly care about another person's welfare more than my own comfort. You have made me want to be worthy of you, and that desire has made me a better person. I love you, Alara said, the words tumbling out as if she could no longer hold them back. I fought against it, told myself it was foolish and impossible. But I love you, Edmund. Not the crown prince, not the title or the power, but you, the man who worked beside me without complaint, who listened to my stories about my mother, who apologized for his mistakes and tried to make them right. Then marry me, Edmund said again. Stand with me as we face whatever consequences come. Be my partner in all things, the person who keeps me honest and reminds me what truly matters. Alara looked into his eyes, searching for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. Yes, God help us both. But yes, I will marry you. Edmund pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as relief and joy flooded through him. She clung to him just as tightly, her face buried against his chest. They stood there in the doorway of her cottage, two people from impossible different worlds who had chosen each other despite every obstacle, every practical consideration, every voice of reason that told them this was madness. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through their tears. We should tell your father, Alara said. He deserves to hear this from you directly. Tomorrow, Edmund agreed. Tonight let us simply be happy. Tomorrow we face the consequences. They spent the evening talking, making plans, acknowledging fears and hopes in equal measure. Edmund told Alara about court life, about the expectations and protocols she would need to navigate. Alara told Edmund about her dreams for how her healing knowledge might be used to help more people, about establishing proper medical training for women, about creating systems to ensure the poor had access to quality care. As darkness fell and Edmund prepared to return to the castle, Alara walked with him to where he had tied his horse. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the forest clearing. Edmund held her once more, memorizing the feeling of her in his arms, the scent of herbs that always clung to her hair, the way she fit perfectly against him. No matter what happens, no matter what challenges we face, remember that I chose this, he said quietly. I chose you, freely and completely, and I will never regret that choice. Nor will I, Alara promised. We are going to face opposition and criticism, and people who believe we are destroying everything they hold dear. But we will face it together. Edmund rode back to Thornwood Castle with his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. He knew the path ahead would be difficult. He knew his decision would anger many and create complications he could not yet foresee. But for the first time since taking on the mantle of Crown Prince, he felt truly alive, truly committed to something that mattered beyond duty and expectation. The next morning, he requested a private audience with his father. King Harold received him in the solar, his expression grave. You have made your decision. I have. I am going to marry Alara with or without your blessing, though I desperately hope to have it. Harold was silent for a long moment. You understand this will not be easy. The council will object. Many of the noble houses will feel insulted. There will be those who question your fitness to rule. I understand all of that, but I also understand that the kind of king I want to be, the kind of king this realm needs, requires me to act with integrity, even when it is difficult. Especially when it is difficult. Edmund met his father's eyes. You taught me that leadership requires sacrifice. I am willing to sacrifice political convenience and noble approval for the sake of being true to myself and to the woman I love." Harold studied his son, and slowly his stern expression softened into something that might have been pride. "You are braver than I was at your age, or perhaps simply more certain of what truly matters." He stood and embraced Edmund, the first time he had done so in years. "You have my blessing, son, and my support in facing whatever storms this decision brings." The announcement was made 3 days later in the great hall, with the full court assembled. Edmund stood before them all, Ilara beside him wearing a simple but elegant dress that Victoria had helped her choose, and declared his intention to make this remarkable healer his wife and future queen. The reaction was exactly what they had expected: shock, outrage, and vocal opposition from many quarters. But there were also voices of support, people who saw in this unusual match the possibility of something new and better, and most importantly, King Harold stood behind his son's decision, making clear that anyone who challenged Edmund's choice challenged the crown itself. Over the following months, Edmund and Ilara navigated the complex process of making their unusual union acceptable to the realm. Edmund made concessions where necessary, formed new alliances to replace those threatened by his choice, and demonstrated through his governance that his marriage to Ilara made him a more effective leader, not a less capable one. Ilara brought her healing knowledge to bear for the benefit of the entire realm, establishing training programs for healers, improving medical care for the poor, and using her unique perspective to help Edmund understand the needs of his subjects in ways no noble advisor could convey. Their wedding, when it finally took place 6 months after Edmund's proposal, was a statement of values as much as a celebration. It combined the grandeur expected of a royal ceremony with elements that honored Ilara's heritage. Healers from across the realm presenting symbolic gifts of herbs and medicines, common people invited to witness the ceremony alongside nobility, vows that spoke of partnership and mutual respect rather than simply duty and obedience. As Edmund and Ilara stood together, their hands joined, speaking promises that would bind their lives together, Edmund felt a profound sense of rightness. This was who he was meant to be, not a prince who maintained comfortable distance from his subjects, but a man who had learned humility and compassion from someone the world had deemed beneath his notice. And Ilara, looking into Edmund's eyes as they exchanged their vows, felt the same certainty. She had lost so much: her mother, her security, her simple life. But she had gained something infinitely more precious: a partner who saw her truly, who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide, who had chosen love over convenience and integrity over tradition. Years later, when historians wrote about the reign of King Edmund and Queen Ilara, they would mark it as a turning point in the realm's history. The king who had humiliated a peasant woman and then married her, who had transformed personal guilt into systemic change, who had proven that true leadership came not from maintaining rigid hierarchies, but from recognizing the worth in every person, regardless of birth or station. But on their wedding day, Edmund and Ilara thought nothing of history or legacy. They simply held each other close, surrounded by people who had come to witness something extraordinary. Two people from impossible different worlds who had found in each other not just love, but the courage to challenge everything they had been taught about how the world must be, and to build something better in its place. And as the celebration continued into the night, as nobles and commoners alike raised their cups to toast the new crowned princess, one truth became clear. Sometimes the most profound changes in history begin not with grand plans or sweeping reforms, but with a single act of humility and the courage to make amends for past wrongs. Edmund had sought to redeem his mistake by asking Ilara to marry him. In doing so, he had redeemed far more than a single act of cruelty. He had redeemed the very idea of what a prince could be, what a marriage could mean, and what kind of realm they all might build together. The story that had begun with humiliation in a market square had transformed into something neither could have imagined: a partnership that would reshape their world, a love that proved stronger than the barriers of class and custom, and a future built not on tradition but on the revolutionary idea that every person deserved dignity, respect, and the opportunity to be valued for who they truly were.